The first time I saw Jaden, I couldn't figure out what was off about him. He wasn't nervous or awkward like a new kid should be. He moved through the classroom as though he already owned it. His hoodie, a blank gray with no logos or designs, looked too pristine, like he'd just peeled off the tags that morning. He didn't shuffle or hesitate. He walked to the back of the room, nodded at the teacher's introduction, and sat down. Then he smiled. It wasn't a big smile, nothing over the top, just a flicker of white teeth, polite and self-assured. But it landed wrong. There was something in his eyes that didn't match the warmth of his expression. They swept across the room, scanning every one of us, and in that brief glance, I felt noticed. Not in a good way. It was like he'd clocked everything about me, my clothes, my posture, even the chipped nail polish on my fingers, and filed it all away for later use. I told myself I was imagining it. By the end of his first week, Jaden wasn't just part of the school. He was its gravitational center. He moved effortlessly between cliques. On Monday, he was high-fiving jocks by the lockers. On Tuesday, he was trading inside jokes with the theater kids. By Friday, he had the band geeks laughing at some story about a legendary music festival he claimed to have attended. He had something for everyone. Compliments for the overachievers, quiet sympathy for the loners, and just the right level of sarcastic humor for the edgy art kids. The first party he threw sealed it. It started as a whisper in the halls. An invitation passed from one mouth to another, like a secret. When I showed up that Saturday night, the place wasn't what I expected. Jaden had said it was his cousin's basement rec room, but it felt off. The room was big, with low ceilings and bare concrete walls, dimly lit by mismatched lamps that cast shadows in the corners. A few folding chairs were set up near a table stacked with unopened snacks and bottles of soda. There were games, music, everything you'd expect at a party. But there was no sense of comfort, no personality. It was as though someone had staged it, set up what they thought a high school party should look like, but missed the soul. And Jaden was everywhere. Laughing, handing people drinks, organizing a game of cards in one corner while showing off the newest PlayStation release in another. Everyone loved him, but every time I looked at him, he was looking at someone else, watching, listening. Even when he laughed, his eyes stayed sharp, calculating. At one point, I wandered into the far corner of the room looking for the bathroom. That's when I noticed it. A small black camera mounted just above the door frame. It was barely noticeable, tucked into the shadows where the wall met the ceiling. "Security," Jaden said from behind me, and I jumped. He was holding 2 cans of soda, his smile as disarming as ever. "You can never be too careful, right? My cousin's kind of paranoid." He handed me a can, popped the tab on his own, and clinked it against mine like a toast. "Glad you came." I didn't drink the soda. By mid-October, Jaden was gone. He missed 3 days of school in a row, and then a week. At first, the rumors were small. He was sick, or maybe grounded. By Friday, the stories spiraled out of control. Someone said he'd gotten into a car accident. Someone else claimed he'd been expelled for stealing tests from the principal's office. The truth didn't come out until Monday morning, when the police showed up. They went straight to the principal's office and then, one by one, pulled 6 students out of class. Kids who'd been at the party. Kids Jaden had spent the most time with. By lunchtime, the whispers were flying faster than the administration could contain them. Jaden wasn't a teenager. His real name wasn't Jaden. He was a 26-year-old man who'd forged transfer papers and a birth certificate to enroll in our school. The police said he was a con artist, but that felt too small to describe what he'd done. They said he'd been trying to build connections. But what kind of connections? What was he planning? The rec room wasn't his cousin's basement. It wasn't even a rental. It was an abandoned apartment he'd broken into, one he'd outfitted with hidden cameras. The cops found recordings of conversations, students laughing, talking about their parents' money, their side gigs, their vulnerabilities. He'd used us like puzzle pieces, putting together some kind of master plan that the police couldn't fully unravel. I wish the story ended there. I wish I could say the school tightened its security protocols, the administration gave its stern announcements, and life went back to normal. But it didn't. Not for me. Not for any of us. After Jaden, everything changed. The laughter in the halls felt hollow. Every new student who walked through the doors made me tense up, waiting for their smile to crack, for the mask to slip. Sometimes, I think about the kids who got pulled into those police interviews. One of them dropped out a month later, just stopped coming to school. Another one started showing up with bruises on her arms, though she swore they were from falling down the stairs. And me? I can't stop seeing cameras, in classrooms, in bathrooms, in the mirror above my dresser. Sometimes I'll be lying in bed, half asleep, and swear I see a little red light blinking from the corner of my room. I've started dreaming about him. In the dreams, he's not smiling anymore. He just stares, and somehow that's worse. The last time I saw Jaden was in the parking lot of a gas station 2 towns over. I was with my mom, grabbing snacks for a road trip, and I caught a glimpse of him through the window of a beat-up car. It was him. I know it was. I froze, staring, waiting for him to turn his head, to meet my eyes. But he didn't. He just sat there, hands on the steering wheel, looking straight ahead, as though he were waiting for something. I told myself I was imagining it. But as we drove away, I couldn't help checking the side mirror. The car pulled out of the lot behind us. He's still out there. And if it wasn't him in that car, then it'll be someone else. Someone with a smile too wide and eyes that see too much. Someone waiting for the next place to belong. It was January, just after 4 in the afternoon, and the sun was already giving up, bleeding orange behind the old auditorium wing. I remember feeling the kind of tired that sinks into your bones, the result of midterm review sessions, basketball practice, and the endless churn of gray winter days. The parking lot stretched ahead of me, mostly empty except for a few scattered cars that clung to the edges like forgotten toys. Custodians, maybe. A couple of teachers who lived for staying late. I'd made it halfway across the asphalt when I heard someone call my name. "Hey!" I turned and saw Mr. Harris, my history teacher, walking toward me. Not just walking, striding, almost marching, his shoes clapping hard against the pavement. His normally easygoing posture was gone. He looked off. His eyes darted toward the chain-link fence at the far end of the lot, like he expected something to materialize there. Something bad. "Let me walk you to your car," he said, slightly out of breath. "What?" I laughed, but it came out weak. "Why? You shouldn't be out here alone." His voice was flat, serious. No jokes, no trivia, no rambling about ancient battles. His usual vibe, the guy who made puns about Alexander the Great, had evaporated. "Mr. Harris, is something wrong?" I asked, gripping the straps of my backpack. A knot tightened in my stomach as the air around us seemed to shift, the cold biting a little deeper. He hesitated, pressing his lips into a thin line. Then he exhaled, his breath curling in the frigid air. "Look, I don't want to freak you out, but I saw someone hanging around after the last bell. A man. He didn't belong here." He threw another glance over his shoulder toward the fence. "I've seen him before, twice this month." "What do you mean, hanging around? Like a parent?" I asked, even though I already knew the answer. Mr. Harris shook his head. "Number. Not a parent. He doesn't come inside, doesn't talk to anyone, just stands there. Watching." "Watching what?" "Everything," he said. His voice dropped lower, as if the words themselves might summon something. "He paces the fence sometimes. Other times he's by the bushes near the maintenance shed. I've called security, even the police. But by the time anyone gets here, he's gone, like he knows we're coming." The knot in my stomach turned to ice. I thought about the bleachers behind the gym, where I'd seen a figure lingering last week after practice. I'd brushed it off, probably the assistant coach or some kid who stayed late to grab their phone from a locker. But now, I wasn't so sure. "Where did you see him today?" My voice felt small, the words barely pushing past my lips. Mr. Harris pointed across the parking lot, toward a cluster of overgrown bushes that curled along the back edge. The maintenance shed loomed behind them, its windows fogged and grimy, its door slightly ajar. Beyond it was the path to the side street. No cameras, no lights, just a narrow stretch of cracked asphalt that disappeared into the trees. "You can't miss him," he said quietly. Hooded coat, baseball cap, and he's not just cutting through. The silence pressed against us, thick and heavy. The low hum of distant traffic barely registered over the pounding of my heart. Every instinct screamed at me to get to my car. "Let's go," he said, motioning for me to walk. His tone left no room for argument. I forced my legs to move, gripping my keys tight in one hand, scanning the parking lot like prey scenting a predator. The rows of cars suddenly seemed like a trap. Too many hiding spots, too many angles to cover. Every shadow felt longer, every corner darker. When we reached my car, Mr. Harris hovered as I fumbled the key into the lock. My hands were trembling now, the sharp click of the lock echoing in the empty lot. He leaned down to my open window, his eyes still scanning the perimeter. "Drive straight home," he said. "Don't stop for anything. And if you see someone following you, go straight to the station. No shortcuts, no back roads." I nodded, my mouth dry. "Thank you, Mr. Harris." He straightened and gave the roof of my car a quick tap. "Be safe." As I pulled out, I glanced in the rearview mirror. He was still standing there under the sickly yellow glow of the lot lamp, his hands in his pockets, his gaze fixed on the bushes by the shed. Beyond him, the fence swayed slightly in the breeze, casting warped shadows on the cracked pavement. I wish that was the end of it. But the very next day, Mr. Harris wasn't there. I heard he'd left early for some meeting downtown. I tried not to think about it as I crossed the parking lot alone. The daylight already fading, the sky bruised purple and gray. I walked quickly, my keys clutched tight, the hairs on my neck prickling. Every instinct told me not to look around, but I couldn't help it. At first, I saw nothing. Just rows of cars, the hulking shapes quiet and still. But then, movement. A darting shadow between a sedan and a pickup truck. A quick shuffle of footsteps behind the maintenance shed. My heart thundered in my chest as I spun around. Nothing. I quickened my pace, the soles of my shoes slapping against the asphalt. My breath was shallow now, coming in sharp bursts. Then I heard it, a low grunt, half a whisper like someone frustrated, or worse, someone waiting. I ran. I didn't even bother looking back. My hands shook as I unlocked the car, yanking the door open and slamming it behind me. The engine roared to life, and I peeled out of the lot, the tires screeching against the pavement. That was weeks ago. I've changed my routine since then. I park closer to the building, leave with friends, check every shadow before I step outside. The police have come by a few times, but they never find anyone. And that's the worst part. Knowing he's still out there, watching, waiting. It's not the kind of fear that comes from horror movies or ghost stories. This isn't about creaking floors or flickering lights. It's worse than that. It's the kind of fear that sticks to you, that makes your skin crawl when you're alone in an empty lot, when you hear footsteps that shouldn't be there. Every night I double-check my door locks. I look out the windows before I turn out the lights. And when I walk to my car, I can't stop imagining him there, lurking behind a bumper, his hood pulled low, his breath fogging in the cold night air. I haven't seen him since that day, but I know he's there, somewhere. I remember it so vividly, and yet I've spent years trying to forget. I was 15, a sophomore just shy of turning 16, stuck on an otherwise ordinary Wednesday afternoon. Debate practice had run late as usual, and by the time we wrapped up, the school was nearly deserted. I boarded the last bus home, joining 6 other students I only vaguely recognized. It was one of those unspoken rules of adolescence. If you didn't know each other well enough to talk in the hallways, you certainly didn't talk on the bus. We sat scattered across the seats, faces lit by the cold glow of phone screens. It had rained earlier, and the windows fogged slightly as the engine hummed to life. Mr. Lewis, our driver, was the same as always, gruff, quiet, unremarkable. He was an older man, balding, with a face like an old paperback left too long in the sun. He never said much, just nodded as we filed on and put the bus into gear. That night, though, I remember thinking he looked distracted. His eyes lingered on the rearview mirror for a beat too long, his lips pressed thin like he was holding back a sigh. We pulled away from the curb, the tires hissing against the wet pavement, and I settled into the familiar rhythm of the ride home. Outside, the world was losing its shape to dusk. The rain had left the roads slick, turning the faint glow of streetlights into long, trembling streaks. At first, I barely noticed we were taking a different route. Maybe he was avoiding construction or a flooded street. He'd done that before. But as the houses thinned out, replaced by dense walls of trees, my unease began to grow. We were somewhere on the outskirts of town, rolling down one of those narrow, winding back roads where the woods press so close that even the moonlight can't find a way through. That's when Mr. Lewis slammed on the brakes. The bus lurched violently, the tires skidding slightly on the wet asphalt. My phone slipped from my hands, and my stomach jolted into my throat. I looked up, expecting to see a deer, a fallen branch, anything to explain the sudden stop. But there was nothing. Just the empty stretch of road ahead, our headlights spilling weakly into the shadows. Without a word, Mr. Lewis stood. His movements were slow, deliberate. He adjusted the brim of his cap, then walked down the narrow aisle. I remember how his shoes scuffed against the rubber flooring, the sound oddly loud in the silence. He didn't look at any of us. He just stepped off the bus, letting the folding door hiss shut behind him. The engine stayed running. The headlights remained on. He didn't take a flashlight or his phone. He just left. At first, none of us moved. The silence was suffocating. The only sound, the soft rumble of the idling engine. Someone in the back, the girl with the bright pink backpack, whose name I didn't know, let out a nervous laugh. "Bathroom break?" she joked, though her voice wavered. "Maybe something's wrong with the bus," said a guy sitting 2 rows ahead of me. His name was Mason. He had a reputation for being the loudest kid in class, but now his voice was barely above a mutter. Nobody answered. My eyes were glued to the windshield, to the empty road stretching out into the trees. The headlights seemed weaker than before, barely cutting through the dark. Minutes passed. The bus felt colder, though I couldn't tell if it was the temperature or just my imagination. I knelt on my seat, craning my neck to look out the side window. All I could see were trees, black and impenetrable. I thought I heard something, branches snapping, leaves rustling, but it could have just been the wind. "Where the hell is he?" someone whispered. "We should go check," said Mason, though he didn't make a move to stand. "No way," snapped the girl with the pink backpack. "Are you insane? We stay inside. He'll be back." But he wasn't back. 5 minutes stretched into 10, then 15. The unease in the air thickened, sharp and sour like the smell of something burning. I pulled out my phone, the screen glaring too brightly in the dim light. No bars. Of course not. We were too far out. The girl across the aisle from me, Emma, I think, held her phone up like a lifeline. She let out a soft, trembling breath. "I have 1 bar," she said. "I'm calling 911. Her voice was shaking as she explained our situation to the dispatcher. I could only hear her side of the conversation, but it didn't sound promising. When she hung up, her hands were trembling. "They said to stay on the bus," she whispered. "They're sending officers." We clung to that promise like a raft in open water, but the minutes dragged on, and with each passing second, the bus felt less like a refuge and more like a cage. Someone started crying, a quiet, muffled sound that only made the silence heavier. "Maybe he saw something," Mason muttered. His face was pale, his knee bouncing nervously. "What?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. He shrugged, but his eyes darted toward the window. "I don't know, like an animal or something, in the trees." "Then why didn't he come back?" Mason didn't answer. Outside, the darkness seemed to press closer. The trees looked wrong, their branches too still, too sharp. My breath fogged up the glass as I leaned closer, straining to see anything beyond the weak glow of the headlights. That's when I saw it. A shadow. It was quick, darting just beyond the edge of the light, too fast to make out. I jerked back, my heart hammering in my chest. "What?" Emma hissed, her eyes wide. "There's something out there," I whispered. I half expected them to laugh or dismiss me, but nobody did. Instead, we all sat frozen, staring at the windows, the darkness suddenly alive with possibilities. The sound of the wind grew louder, or maybe it was something else, something moving just beyond our sight. When the red and blue lights of the patrol car finally appeared in the distance, the relief was so sharp it made me dizzy. The officers were cautious as they approached, their flashlights cutting through the shadows. One of them boarded the bus, his hand resting on his holster. He asked us where the driver had gone, but none of us had an answer. They searched the area for nearly an hour, their voices crackling faintly over the radio. When they returned, they looked shaken but offered no explanation. They escorted us off the bus, loading us into their cars to take us back to the station. Later, I heard that they found Mr. Lewis miles away, wandering down another back road. His clothes were soaked, his hands covered in scratches like he'd been running through the woods. He refused to explain what had happened, and the police didn't push him. He was no longer with the company, the school said. That was the only explanation we ever got. But I can't shake the feeling that he saw something out there, something that terrified him enough to leave us behind. Even now, years later, I still think about that night, about the shadow I saw or thought I saw, and the feeling of being watched. Sometimes I wonder if Mr. Lewis ran to save himself, or to save us. The first note appeared on a Thursday during third period history class. I was hunched over my notebook, scribbling down Mr. H's lecture before he could veer off into one of his famous tangents, when I felt it, something brushing lightly against my foot. Just the faintest scrape, like a loose pen rolling by. I glanced down, expecting to see a pencil, or maybe a crumpled up piece of homework someone had tossed aside. Instead, I saw a balled up piece of paper wedged between my foot and the desk leg. It looked damp at the edges, the paper thin and crinkled, with a faint smear of dirt streaked along one side, like it had been dragged across the floor for a while. I uncrumpled it, thinking it was just some trash, maybe someone's grocery list or a forgotten doodle. But no. The writing inside was deliberate. Uneven, shaky handwriting slanted across the page, forming a single sentence. I know where you sit every day. The letters weren't quite right. Some were pressed so hard they'd almost torn through the paper. Others trailed off as though written in a moving car. Something about it felt wrong. Like it wasn't just hurried, but anxious, deliberate in its unevenness. My heart stuttered in my chest. I glanced around the room, but no one was paying attention. A couple of kids were zoning out, doodling in their notebooks. Someone in the front row yawned. This had to be a prank. It had to be. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being targeted. My seat was always the same, back row, near the window. No one ever tried to take it from me. Who would want to? It was next to the radiator that hissed and rattled all winter long, spitting out lukewarm air. I laughed under my breath, trying to brush off the unease and stuff the note into my backpack. Just a stupid joke, I told myself. Nothing more. The second note appeared on Monday. I slid into my usual seat, still groggy from the weekend, and there it was. Folded neatly on the desk. For a moment, I thought maybe it was just an old assignment Mr. H had left for me. But when I opened it, my stomach dropped. You never eat in the cafeteria. My mouth went dry. It was true. I didn't. The cafeteria was too loud, too crowded. I hated the crush of bodies, the overlapping conversations that bounced off the walls. I usually ate by my locker, half hidden behind the vending machine, scarfing down a peanut butter sandwich before the next bell. It wasn't exactly a secret, but it wasn't something anyone paid attention to. This wasn't random. Someone was watching me. By Wednesday, the notes had become a regular occurrence. I saw you waiting for the late bus. You wear the same red hoodie a lot. You always tap your pencil 3 times before you write. Each one was short, mundane. But somehow, That made them worse. Whoever was writing these had been paying attention to things I didn't even realize I was doing. Tiny, unconscious habits. It wasn't just a prank anymore. It was personal. Intimate. I started watching everyone around me, in class, in the hallways, at my locker. Was it that kid with the earbuds who always lingered by the water fountain? Or the girl in the corner of the room, chewing on her pen as she stared out the window? Every face felt suspicious. Every movement had a weight it hadn't carried before. I tried to act normal, like the notes didn't bother me, but my nerves betrayed me. My hands shook when I reached for my pen. My breaths came too fast, too shallow. By Friday, my stomach twisted into knots just walking into history class. That day, the note was different. You'll regret ignoring me. No observations this time. No mundane details. Just a threat. I felt the blood drain from my face. My chest tightened, my pulse racing so fast I could hear it in my ears. I shoved the note into my backpack and bolted the second the bell rang. I told the guidance counselor everything, showed them the notes. They called in the assistant principal, who asked all the usual questions. Did I know anyone who might want to mess with me? Had I had any arguments lately? Any fights? Enemies? I couldn't think of anyone. I wasn't popular, but I wasn't exactly a target either. I kept to myself, invisible for the most part. They promised to check the security cameras, but my stomach sank as soon as I remembered. The older wing of the school, where my history class was, had terrible coverage. Blind spots everywhere. And even if they found something, would it really help? For a while, the notes stopped. I thought maybe it was over. Whoever it was had gotten bored, moved on. But I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. In the hallways, I'd catch myself glancing over my shoulder, scanning the faces of the kids behind me. At my locker, I'd check the corner of my eye for movement. Every time the door creaked open, my body tensed, bracing for something. Even at home, I couldn't escape it. I started keeping my bedroom blinds closed, the door locked. I carried pepper spray in my jacket pocket, though I hated how ridiculous it made me feel. Weeks passed, then months. No new notes appeared, but the unease never left. It was a Friday morning in April when I found it again, not on my desk, not in my backpack. This time, it was tucked inside the front pocket of my red hoodie. I didn't even notice it until I reached in for my earbuds during study hall. The paper was smooth, fresh, no dirt, no crinkles. I unfolded it with trembling hands, my breath caught in my throat. I'm still here. My vision tunneled. The room around me faded, distant voices and the scrape of chairs blurring into static. Whoever they weren't done. And now they didn't care if I knew. I stuffed the note into my pocket, my pulse hammering against my ribs. I wanted to look around, to do something, but my body stayed frozen, like a deer in headlights. For the rest of the day, I couldn't stop thinking about the note, turning it over and over in my mind. When I finally got home, I checked my window locks for the third time that week, then the door, then the pepper spray. It sat in my pocket, cold and small, like a pathetic shield against something I couldn't even see. That night, I didn't sleep. I wish I could tell you I figured out who it was, that the school found something on the cameras, or that the notes stopped forever. But the truth? I never found out. It's been months now, and I still carry the pepper spray everywhere I go. Still glance over my shoulder when I walk home. Still wake up in the middle of the night, my heart pounding at every creak in the floorboards. The scariest part isn't the notes. It's not even the idea that someone, somewhere, is watching me. It's knowing that it could happen again, anytime, anywhere, to anyone, even you. I'll never forget the way that backpack looked, slumped under the old auditorium seats like it didn't belong, like it was trying to hide. It was after last week's school assembly, one of those start-of-semester marathons where the principal lectures us about dress codes and hallway behavior. The kind of event where no one pays attention. As soon as the mic clicked off, everyone surged toward the doors, eager to escape into the chaos of lunch. I was about to leave too when I noticed it. At first glance, it was just a backpack, the kind you see every day. Navy blue, frayed straps, a busted zipper at the top. Someone had shoved it halfway under a seat, forgotten maybe, like a stray hoodie or a lunchbox. But there was something about the way it sat there, slouched in the shadows, that made me hesitate. I grabbed it anyway. It felt heavier than I expected, the straps rough against my palms. I told myself I was just doing the right thing. People lose things all the time, and I figured someone would freak out later when they realized they were missing their notes or wallet. So I carried it to the front office. The secretary barely glanced at it before tossing it onto the lost and found shelf with the rest of the forgotten junk. I left feeling oddly proud, like I'd done my good deed for the day. The next morning started like every other. I got off the bus, joined the tidal wave of students shoving their way through the hall, and headed for my locker. I was laughing with a friend about how much homework we'd already been assigned when the PA system crackled to life. "Students and staff," the principal's voice echoed, tight and trembling. "This is a lockdown. This is not a drill. Teachers, secure your classrooms immediately." A wave of silence rippled through the hall, cutting conversations mid-sentence. For a second, no one moved. Then the sound of slamming doors and hurried footsteps filled the air. My stomach dropped. Lockdown drills happened all the time, but this felt different. Real. The kind of real that makes your skin go cold and your breath stick in your throat. I bolted into the nearest classroom. The teacher locked the door, flipped off the lights, and gestured for us to huddle in the corner, away from the windows. I squeezed into the tight space with 20 other kids, knees pressed to my chest, heart hammering. No one spoke. The only sounds were the faint hum of the air conditioning and the occasional shuffle of someone shifting uncomfortably. Minutes dragged like hours. My mind raced through every terrible possibility. Was there a shooter in the building? A bomb threat? Someone's phone buzzed softly and we all jumped. Then came the voices, muffled, hurried, right outside the door. My pulse spiked. Shadows moved under the crack in the doorframe, 2, maybe 3 people. Whispers rippled through the room. Police. It's the police. When the all clear finally came, the relief was so sharp it made me dizzy. Teachers led us single file out of the building, past a line of police cars parked at the entrance. The air outside was heavy with whispers and unspoken fear. That's when I overheard it. 2 officers were talking, their voices low but urgent. "A note," one said, "found in a backpack, detailed enough to be credible. He was planning something big." A backpack. The words hit me like ice water. My chest tightened as a sickening thought clawed its way into my mind. Could it be? I found a teacher I trusted and asked her what had happened. She hesitated, glancing around like she wasn't sure if she should tell me. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow. "Someone left a backpack in the auditorium," she said quietly. Inside, there was a note. A plan for an attack. They think it belonged to a former student, someone who was expelled last semester. The weight in my chest dropped like a stone. I didn't need to hear the rest. I already knew. I was the one who had found that backpack. I was the one who had carried it to the office. Unwittingly, I had delivered it straight into the hands of the school staff. Later, I learned the details. The note described a plan to strike during a school event. Maybe not that day. Maybe another. The backpack had been rigged with something. The police wouldn't say what exactly, but they made it clear it wasn't just empty words. The person who left it had slipped into the assembly unnoticed, dropped the bag, and disappeared into the crowd. For the rest of the week, the school buzzed with rumors. Some said the suspect had been caught. Others claimed he was still out there. Teachers tried to act like everything was normal, but we could all see the tension in their eyes. In the halls, students flinched at every loud noise, every sudden movement. We avoided the auditorium entirely, as if just stepping inside might trigger something. At night, I replayed the moment under the auditorium seats over and over. The weight of the bag on my shoulder. The way it felt heavier than it should have. If I hadn't picked it up, would things have turned out differently? Would he have come back for it? Would the plan have gone through? Would my school have been another headline? The what-ifs spiraled endlessly in my mind. I tried to tell myself I'd done the right thing, that turning it in had saved us all. But deep down, I wasn't sure. It's been a week now. The police have moved on, and the school is pretending everything is fine. But it's not. We're not. Everyone is different, quieter, more watchful. Every time I see a backpack left unattended, my chest tightens and my hands start to shake. It was a person, someone we used to know, someone who had walked these halls, eaten in our cafeteria, laughed at our jokes. That's what haunts me most. Every day I scan the crowds, searching for something or someone that doesn't belong. I tell myself it's over, that we're safe. But then I remember how easy it was for him to slip in unnoticed. And I wonder who might be watching us now. The computer lab was supposed to be empty. I was supposed to be alone. It was my junior year of high school, and my group had bailed again on our project due the next morning. So there I was, after hours, the hum of computers my only company. When I looked up for the first time, it was already 9:42 p.m. The entire school beyond the lab was black and lifeless, as if the walls had swallowed everyone and left me behind. The sound of a vacuum cleaner echoed faintly in the distance. That was my first mistake, letting the sound comfort me, convincing myself that someone else was here. 15 more minutes, I thought. I'd pack up and go. The first time I saw him, I was working on a PowerPoint slide, typing in the dark with the artificial glow of the monitor burning my retinas. Out of the corner of my eye, movement caught me. A figure passed the window of the lab door. A tall man in a gray uniform pushing one of those heavy, sloshing mop buckets. The wheels squeaked as he passed. I almost didn't look up, but something made me. When I glanced at the window, he was staring at me, just for a second. His eyes were blank, like he'd forgotten how to move his face. When our eyes met, I nodded awkwardly, my throat dry. He turned and continued on. I told myself it was nothing. Custodians always worked late, but then I realized I didn't hear the wheels of his bucket anymore. A few minutes later, he passed the window again. Slower this time. No mop bucket. Just him. He paused, long enough that I couldn't pretend not to notice. His head tilted, just slightly, like he was trying to listen through the glass. I froze. He couldn't see me clearly through the reflection of the monitor. Could he? He moved on, this time toward the corner where the hallway faded into darkness. I stared at my screen, trying to focus, but my stomach churned with unease. A noise. Click. Soft, almost imperceptible, but enough to make my skin crawl. I turned my head. The hallway outside the lab door was dark, not dim, pitch black. The sound came again. Click. It was the lights. The sections of the hallway were turning off, one by one. I watched as the darkness advanced, swallowing the school corridor in neat, precise blocks. It stopped at the one light in front of the computer lab door, leaving it like a spotlight surrounded by a void. The hum of the computers felt louder now. Too loud. I glanced back at the window, and my heart stopped. The custodian was standing there, not walking past, not working, just standing there. His face was too pale under the fluorescence. His head cocked again, further this time, like his neck was straining under something heavy. Then the door handle jiggled. I jumped. The sound echoed. I stared as the handle shook, rattling harder and harder against the lock. The window was too small to see much, but I saw his fingers on the glass, just resting there. Spread wide. I licked my lips. My voice came out hoarse. "Hello? I'm still in here." The rattling stopped. The fingers slid slowly down the glass, leaving faint streaks. He turned, shuffling into the shadows of the hallway until I couldn't see him anymore. I waited. I held my breath for what felt like hours, watching the darkness. Nothing. I wasn't staying. I grabbed my laptop, crammed it into my bag, and slung it over my shoulder. I told myself I was fine, that I'd just misread something. But as I stepped into the hallway, the silence hit me. It was heavy, thick, like breathing underwater. The exit at the far end of the school, the emergency door near the shop classrooms, glowed faintly with a red exit sign. It was the only light left on. The main entrance was somewhere behind me, blocked by darkness that felt alive. I walked quickly, my sneakers squeaking against the linoleum. I felt the rows of classrooms on either side, dark mouths gaping open. Each window I passed was like an empty eye socket staring at me. Shuffle. I stopped dead. The sound came from behind me, not footsteps, something being dragged. I turned. The hallway was empty. I couldn't see past a few feet. A single sound, wet, like rubber on tile, echoed faintly. The back of my neck prickled. I turned and walked faster, my bag bouncing against my hip. The red exit sign grew closer, but it felt too far away. Shuffle. Closer. I ran. The sound behind me was faster now. Sprinting, sliding, slapping. My heart was hammering so hard I thought it would burst. My vision blurred. I could hear something, just under the sound of my feet. Breathing. I slammed into the emergency door. My hands fumbled at the bar before I shoved it open. Cold air hit me, and I staggered out into the night. I ran halfway across the parking lot before I turned around. The door I'd just come through was propped open, and he was standing there. The custodian. His gray uniform looked wrong now, too baggy. He was taller than I remembered, unnaturally so. His head tilted as he stared at me. His face, pale and sagging, looked like it didn't fit his skull. And then, From inside the building, behind him, I heard something else. A voice. She looked up at me, frowning. Custodians finish at 9. No one works past that. No, I saw him, I said. Tall, bald, gray uniform. Her face went blank. Excuse me? I swallowed hard. Tall, bald. He turned off the lights. He chased me. She stared at me for a beat too long. Then quietly she said, "We don't have anyone like that on staff." But Are you sure you weren't imagining things? She was still staring as I backed out of the office, her smile too polite, her eyes too sharp. I never stayed late again. And sometimes, when I think about that voice, help me. I wonder if he's still there. I wonder if he's watching someone else right now. And I wonder if next time, whoever hears that voice won't make it to the door. I've never shared this with anyone before, but I need to get it off my chest. It's been 3 years, and I still think about it almost every day. Not just at night. It hits me at random times. At work, on the bus. I'll be scrolling my phone, perfectly fine, and then bam, I'm back in the woods, back on the ground. I keep wondering if they would have called for help, or if they'd have just left me there. I transferred to a new high school halfway through sophomore year. My mom got a new job in another state, and I didn't have a say. New house, new school, new everything. I'm not great at making friends, so the first week I just floated. Ate lunch alone, hovered near the back of the cafeteria like a ghost. Not in some sad, dramatic way. I just didn't know anyone yet. On Wednesday, a group of seniors waved me over. 4 of them. They didn't look like popular kids, more like the guys who sit at the back of class throwing stuff at each other. One of them had bleach blonde hair, so dry it looked like straw. Another had a scar running through his eyebrow, and it made his whole face look crooked. They seemed cool at first, loud, but in a way that felt like confidence. They joked a lot, messed with each other, messed with me too. Called me new kid over and over, which I didn't love, but it was better than being ignored. By Friday, I was eating lunch with them. I told myself it was progress. They told stories about wild stuff, sneaking into abandoned houses, messing with cops, party fights, and that kind of thing. They talked like they'd done it all. I figured most of it was just lies to sound cool. That's why, when Marcus, Scarface, said, "We're meeting at the baseball field after school. You down?" I said yes. I don't even know why. I guess I didn't want to look scared. After school, I checked my phone 3 times to make sure I wasn't too early or too late. I didn't want to be the loser standing around by himself. When I got there, they were already waiting at the edge of the woods behind the field. Marcus waved me over, grinning like we'd been friends for years. "Finally, man," he said, clapping me on the back. "Thought you chickened out." "Yeah, we were about to call you a no-show," Jordan, the blonde one, said, his grin a little too sharp. I laughed, but it came out weird, too quick. My nerves were kicking in, but I ignored it. Don't be the little kid who's scared of the woods. We walked in deeper, further than I thought we'd go. The air got colder. I started to hear the sound of dry leaves under my feet and the distant creaking of branches. I kept looking back, expecting to still see the school, but it was gone. Nothing but trees. They were still talking, cracking jokes, but something felt different. Like they were talking around me, not to me. Every now and then I'd catch them glancing at each other like they were in on some secret. Finally, Marcus stopped walking. The others stopped too, forming a loose circle. "All right, new kid," Marcus said, pulling his phone out of his hoodie pocket. He held it up with the camera facing me. "Say something for the video." I blinked at him. "What?" "Come on, man," Jordan said, leaning forward, eyes locked on me. His smile was gone. "Introduce yourself. Tell us who you are." Puffy jacket guy snickered. "Yeah, tell us what it's like being the new kid." I didn't know what to say. I glanced from face to face, looking for a sign this was just a joke. The camera's red dot blinked at me. I don't know," I said, rubbing the back of my neck. "It's fine, I guess." I tried to laugh, but it didn't sound right. Jordan squinted at me like I'd just said something stupid. "It's fine, I guess," he said in this high, mocking voice. "Man, you're boring as hell." That's when Marcus shoved me. It was light at first, a playful push to the shoulder. I stumbled a little and laughed, trying to play along, but then Jordan shoved me from behind harder. I had to take a quick step forward to stay on my feet. "Don't be soft, new kid," he said. I smiled, but I could feel my heart beating in my neck. My hands felt hot. "Look at him," Puffy Jacket said. "Dude's scared." "I'm not scared," I snapped. I don't know why I said it. Stupid thing to say. "Oh, he's not scared, guys," Marcus said, pointing the camera at me like I was a clown at a birthday party. "Say it again, new kid. Tell him you're not scared." I raised my hands. "Dude, stop. This isn't funny." That's when Jordan shoved me hard, both hands to my chest. I wasn't ready for it. My foot caught on something behind me, a root, maybe, and I felt my whole body tilt backward. I'm going down, I thought. I hit the ground hard, but that wasn't the worst part. My head slammed into something solid. A rock, I think. I don't remember the sound it made, but I felt it. It wasn't sharp pain at first. It was this blinding white flash inside my head, like a camera flash went off behind my eyes. Then everything went quiet. I could hear this high electric ringing. I didn't move. I could hear them, though. Hear them moving around me. Their voices sounded far away. "Dude, what do we do?" "Shut up," Marcus hissed. His voice was closer. "Is he dead?" Puffy Jacket asked. His voice sounded small, like a kid who's about to cry. "No, he's breathing," Marcus said. His words were fast, shaky. "He's fine. He's fine." "Bro, his head's bleeding," the quiet one said. The one who barely talked before. "Shut up." They were circling me, leaves crunching under their feet. I lay perfectly still, heart hammering, blood hot in my ears. I remember thinking, if they realize I'm awake, they'll hurt me worse. I kept my eyes closed. "Let's just go," someone whispered. Yeah, let's go." They left. They ran. I listened to their footsteps get quieter and quieter until I couldn't hear them anymore. I still didn't move. I stayed like that until my chest hurt from holding my breath. Finally, I opened my eyes. The world tilted. My head throbbed like someone was pushing a spike into the back of my skull. I reached back, felt something warm and sticky on my neck. My fingers came away red. I thought, not too much blood. That's good, right? I sat up slowly. The world kept spinning. For a second, I thought I might throw up. I stared at the trees until it passed. Then I got up and walked. I don't know how I made it home. I don't remember most of it. I just remember my mom freaking out when she saw the blood. She drove me to the ER. I got 3 staples in the back of my head. The doctor asked me a lot of questions. I lied. I said I tripped on the sidewalk. The next Monday, I ate lunch alone. Marcus and the others didn't say a word to me, didn't even glance at me. I think that scared me more than anything. A week later, I passed them in the hall. They were laughing with some other kids. Jordan was telling a story. I heard him say, "We got it on video, bro. Dude ate it so hard." He didn't know I heard. I never told anyone what happened. Not my mom, not the school, definitely not the police. But I think about it all the time. I think about lying there, flat on my back, my head leaking into the dirt, hearing them whispering like scared little kids. And I keep wondering, if I hadn't woken up, if I'd stayed still just a little too long, would they have called for help? Or would they have just left me there? I think I already know the answer. I don't know how to process what happened tonight, but I need to get it out while it's still fresh. I'm not even sure if I'll leave this up, but if you're reading this, I guess I did. There's no ghosts or demons in this story, no monsters hiding in the shadows, just people. And somehow, that makes it so much worse. I've known Raul and Ricky since freshman year. Identical twins, same dumb grin, same sharp eyes, same habit of looking at you like they know something you don't. If you've ever met twins like them, you know what I mean. They weren't bullies, but they had that edge. The kind of kids who'd toss your phone on the roof just to see how you'd react. By senior year, I'd gotten used to it. Hell, I'd even started hanging out with them. Not best friends or anything, but we shared a table at lunch, roasted each other, played games on our phones. They were fun. Until they weren't. Raul texted me at 10:32 p.m. "Come through. Me and Ricky got a plan LMAO." I asked him what kind of plan. He said something about sneaking into Coach Lewis's office. I'm not proud of it, but Coach Lewis is that guy. Calls you princess if you mess up a play. Stares at the girls' track team too long. Everyone hates him, and honestly, I didn't mind the idea of them messing with him. Dumb, but tempting. I told them I'd think about it. Raul sent back a single message. "Don't be a coward." That should have been my first red flag. But I told myself it's Raul being Raul. I wasn't going to be the guy they clowned on in the group chat tomorrow. I got to the field at 11:45 p.m., quiet as a dead channel, no floodlights, no sound except for the hum of the streetlights over the parking lot. Just that thick kind of silence you only get late at night. I almost left. Then I saw them. Two figures stepping out of the trees by the far end of the field. Raul waved. Ricky stood beside him. Neither of them spoke. Just watched me cross the field like they had all the time in the world. I laughed when I got close, trying to break the silence. "What's with the horror movie vibe?" Raul grinned. "Keeps you on your toes." Ricky didn't say anything. They pulled ski masks from a backpack. Ricky tossed one to me. "Put it on," he said, pulling his own mask down. I held it in my hand. It smelled like rubber and old detergent. "You serious?" I asked. "Coach Lewis has cameras," Raul said, pulling his mask down too. "What? You want him to see your pretty face?" They both laughed like it was the funniest joke in the world. I figured, fine, whatever. Play along. I slid the mask on. It itched. Hard to see through the tiny eye holes. I could just barely make out their faces behind their masks. Their eyes were clear, though. Too clear. They weren't laughing anymore. Raul checked his phone. "All right," he said, looking at Ricky. Ricky nodded once. Raul turned to me. His tone changed. Clipped. Precise. "Here's the twist," he said. "You have 10 seconds to run." I waited for them to laugh. They didn't. 10, Ricky said. His voice was louder now, steady. I felt something twist in my chest. All right, guys, real funny. Seriously. 9, Raoul said. They started walking toward me, not running, not rushing, just walking. 8. I backed up a step, then another. They kept walking, same pace, same direction. 7. Okay, seriously, I said, raising my hands. My voice cracked and I hated that. I hated that so much. It's not funny. 6. They tilted their heads at the same time, like they'd practiced it, like they'd done it before. 5. My body moved before my brain did. I took a step back, then another. I glanced over my shoulder, field, bleachers, parking lot. I knew the distance in my head. Too far. Too far. 4. I turned and ran. I've never run so fast in my life. It wasn't even a choice. My body knew before I did. Run now or don't run at all. I didn't look back. I heard them, though. They weren't quiet. Heavy steps hitting the ground behind me. 2 pairs of feet. Fast. But worse than that, worse than the footsteps, was the sound of them laughing. Not normal laughter. It was sharp, wild, like they were gasping for air between each breath but still thought it was hilarious. Faster! Faster! Ricky yelled, his voice high and raw. I cut left, hard, feet sliding in the grass. I ran for the chain-link fence by the bleachers. My lungs were fire. My legs were bricks. I didn't care. I wasn't stopping. Almost got him! Raoul's voice, close, closer than I thought. I hit the fence hard. Metal shook. I climbed like my life depended on it, because it did. Hands on cold metal, feet slipping. I threw myself over the top and hit the ground wrong. My ankle bent. I felt something shift. Pain shot up my leg. I stumbled, limped, ran anyway. I heard them hit the fence behind me. It rattled hard, too hard. Come on, I whispered, dragging my leg like dead weight. The streetlights weren't far. Just had to make it to the lights. Streetlights meant cars, people, safety. I glanced back once. Just once. They were standing on the other side of the fence, still, watching me, not moving. I don't know if they could see my face under the mask, but I know they saw me looking. Ricky raised his hand, just raised it slowly, fingers spread, like he was showing me something. Then Raoul did the same. They didn't say a word. They didn't follow me home. They didn't text me either. I've been sitting here for an hour, phone in my hand, waiting, refreshing, waiting for them to say something. Nothing. Not one message. I keep thinking about that moment when Raoul and Ricky tilted their heads at the same time. I know twins have that whole twin telepathy thing, but this wasn't that. It wasn't them reading each other. They were reading me. Update, 3:34 a.m. I just got a text from an unknown number. No message, just an image. It's me. I'm in the frame, running. My ski mask is still on. The camera's behind me like someone was following me. Raoul is in the picture too. He's not running. He's standing perfectly still in the middle of the field, facing the camera, holding his phone up. Taking the picture. No caption, no other texts, just that image. Update, 4:12 a.m. There's a knock at the door. I'm not going to answer it. I remember that morning vividly, even though it's been a couple of years now. We were halfway through sophomore year, and Mr. Gonzalez, our usual history teacher, had called in sick. I wasn't too surprised. He'd been coughing and sniffling the day before, and subs weren't uncommon. But when the bell rang and the substitute walked in, something felt wrong. He was tall, maybe in his early 40s, with thinning brown hair and wire-rimmed glasses. His clothes were ordinary, just a button-down shirt and khakis. But his face was unsettling, not in any obvious way, but there was a stillness to it, like his expression had been carved out of stone. Most substitutes tried to put us at ease, cracking a joke or at least offering a quick smile. He didn't. Instead, he marched straight to the front of the room, his footsteps precise, almost mechanical, and without introducing himself, he said, "Phones." On my desk, the room stilled. It wasn't the request that threw us. Some teachers were strict about phones. It was the way he said it, like the words weren't a request at all, but a command carved into stone centuries ago, one we had no choice but to obey. His voice was low and cold, as though he barely needed to raise it to control the room. A few kids hesitated, glancing at each other, but no one dared challenge him. One by one, we filed up to the desk, placing our phones into his waiting hands. He didn't look at us as we did. His eyes stayed fixed on some invisible point ahead. When the last phone was in the drawer, he locked it with a small silver key and slid it into his pocket. Then he walked to the door, turned the lock with a quiet click, and stood there for a moment, his hand resting on the handle as if to test its weight. I don't know why, but my stomach knotted at that small action. There was no scheduled drill that day, no reason for the door to be locked. He turned back to us, arms folded, and said, "Open your textbooks to page 132. Read silently. No talking, no worksheets, no lecture, nothing. Just read." It wasn't unheard of for subs to keep things simple, but this was different. He didn't sit or pace the room. He didn't even glance at his own copy of the textbook. He just stood at the front, hands clasped, his eyes sweeping over us like a security camera. At first, we tried to do as we were told, but the silence quickly became unbearable. It pressed down on us, thick and stifling. I could hear every fidget, every shuffle of paper, every breath. A girl in the back, Emma, raised her hand. "Excuse me, Mr. Do not speak unless called upon," he cut her off sharply. His tone wasn't angry, but it carried weight, like steel wrapped in silk. Emma sank back into her chair, her face pale. A few students exchanged uneasy whispers, but the man's head snapped in their direction immediately. No talking. His voice sliced through the air, and even the whispers stopped. My heart thudded in my chest. I wanted to look at the clock, but I didn't dare. Time felt frozen. After maybe 20 minutes, though it felt much longer, there was a knock at the door. 3 sharp raps. Everyone jumped, even the substitute. The principal's muffled voice called out from the hallway, "Mr. Gonzalez, is the substitute here?" The substitute's head jerked toward the door. For the first time, his calm mask cracked. I saw something flicker in his eyes. Was it panic? He froze for a moment, his hand gripping the edge of the desk so tightly his knuckles went white. Then, without a word, he strode toward the windows at the side of the room. The windows in that classroom barely opened, maybe an inch or two at most, just enough to let in a breeze on warm days. They were high up too, with heavy frames, the kind you'd need both hands to budge. But before I could fully process what I was seeing, the substitute had moved behind the tall cabinets near the windows, slipping out of sight. The principal knocked again. "Hello? Is anyone there?" We all sat frozen, staring at the door. The substitute didn't reappear. I craned my neck, trying to see behind the cabinets, but he was gone. The windows didn't look disturbed. There was no sound of a door opening, no sign of movement at all. The door handle rattled, and the principal let himself in with a master key. We all started talking at once. How the substitute had locked us in, taken our phones. How he had disappeared. The principal looked around the room, frowning. "What substitute?" he asked. We described the man, down to the wire-rimmed glasses and the key he'd used to lock the drawer. The principal's face darkened. "There was no substitute scheduled today," he said. "Mr. Gonzalez called in sick this morning, but we weren't able to send anyone down until after lunch." The room fell silent. Several of us insisted that we'd seen him, that he'd been there for the past 20 minutes, but the principal just shook his head. "Stay here," he said, and left the room, locking the door behind him. He came back 10 minutes later, pale and shaken. "We've reviewed the security footage," he said, his voice tight. "No one entered this room after the first bell. No one at all." We got our phones back. The drawer was still locked when the principal checked, but the silver key was gone. The police were called. They asked us questions, took statements. No one could explain it. They checked the windows, the vents, the hallway cameras. Nothing. It was like the man had never existed. A week later, the school sent a letter home, promising that student safety was their top priority, and assuring us the incident was being investigated. But no one ever followed up. No one ever explained how a stranger could appear and disappear without a trace. The whole thing was quietly buried. Most of the kids in that class tried to move on, but I couldn't. I still wake up at night sometimes, my heart pounding, remembering the cold weight of his stare. For months, I avoided looking out windows at night, terrified I'd see him standing there just watching. Sometimes, I swear I feel his presence, at the edge of a crowd, in the corner of my vision, in the long, silent stretches of the night. I don't know who or what he was, but I know one thing for certain. He was never supposed to be there. I know how ridiculous this will sound, but I swear it really happened. And to this day, I still don't have a definitive explanation. It was my senior year of high school, a time when everything felt heightened, anticipation for the future, nostalgia for what I was leaving behind. My school had this long-standing tradition. Toward the back of the annual yearbook, there was a memorial page dedicated to alumni who had passed away. It was always a solemn, respectful tribute. Photos, names, the year they graduated, and their birth and death dates. Most of the memorialized were older, people who had deep roots in the town. Even though I didn't recognize many of the names, the page always felt heavy, like stepping into a quiet room where you were expected to lower your voice. When we got our freshly printed yearbooks that spring, I was sitting on the low brick wall behind the gym with my friends. The air smelled like cut grass and cheap barbecue from the senior BBQ down the hill. We were flipping through the pages, laughing at ridiculous candids, hunting for embarrassing inside jokes. It was a ritual of sorts, taking stock of how we wanted to remember the last 4 years. I don't know why I turned to the back. Maybe it was morbid curiosity, or maybe I just wanted to see if anyone I vaguely remembered had made it onto the memorial page that year. But as I flipped toward it, a knot of unease tightened in my chest. I hesitated, just for a second, and then turned the page. And there I was. It was my senior portrait, the exact one I had chosen, staring back at me with that forced half-smile. Below my name were my birth year, and impossibly, the current year, as the year of death. The photograph was crisp, the text perfectly aligned. My name was unmistakable. I felt my chest constrict. The world tilted slightly, like gravity had shifted. For a second, I forgot how to breathe. My friends' voices faded into white noise as I stared down at the page, trying to convince myself that it was some kind of optical illusion. Holy... My friend Beth leaned over my shoulder and froze. Her face paled. "What the hell?" Her words brought the others over, and soon they were gathered around, all of them staring at the page. No one laughed. No one even cracked a joke. A couple of them glanced at me, then quickly looked away like they didn't want to meet my eyes. "It's a prank, right?" I tried to laugh, but the sound came out hollow and strained. I grabbed another yearbook from someone's hands and flipped to the page. My face stared back at me from that copy too. The same layout, the same dates. It wasn't a printing error in just my book. It was in all of them. The laughter and chatter around us dimmed as the news spread. I could feel people watching me, their eyes heavy with confusion, and beneath that, something like fear. One guy muttered under his breath, "You know, sometimes these things are omens." Someone else whispered, "I wouldn't want to stand too close to him." I slammed the book shut and made a beeline for the yearbook advisor's office, dragging Beth with me. The advisor was hunched over her desk when I stormed in, thrusting the yearbook onto the desk in front of her. She flipped to the page and froze. I watched her face drain of color, her lips parting soundlessly. "Oh my God," she whispered. "Oh my God, this is awful." "How does something like this even happen?" I demanded. "Why is my picture there?" I don't know." She fumbled for her phone. "This must have been a layout error. Maybe the printer. Or..." She trailed off, her voice shaky. "I'll talk to the staff. I'm so sorry. Truly. We'll issue a retraction. Maybe print an addendum." That addendum never came. The school's official explanation was that my photo had been accidentally placed in the memorial section due to some kind of tech glitch or miscommunication with the printer. But no one could explain how it happened. My photo shouldn't have even been near the memorial layouts. No one could tell me who was responsible. And the more I pressed, the more people seemed eager to just let the whole thing blow over. But it didn't blow over. Not for me. The rumors started almost immediately. I'd overhear whispers in the cafeteria. "It's like he's marked or something. Maybe he's not even supposed to be here." It was superstitious nonsense, but in a small town like ours, where weird stories grew like weeds, it didn't take much to spark a wildfire. Even my friends started acting differently. It was subtle at first. A hesitation when I joined a conversation, an awkward silence when I made plans for the summer. But as the weeks went on, the distance grew. By the time senior parties rolled around, I wasn't getting invited anymore. At the senior BBQ, people gave me sidelong glances like I was already halfway out of their lives, as though I was some kind of living ghost. Graduation was the worst. Walking up to the stage to collect my diploma felt surreal, like I was an actor playing a role in someone else's life. I could feel the eyes of my classmates boring into me, a mix of pity and unease. When the principal called my name, there was a moment, a fraction of a second, where the applause faltered, like everyone was holding their breath to see if I would vanish. After the ceremony, I skipped the celebrations. I went home, took off my gown, and shoved the yearbook into a box in the back of my closet. Years passed. I left for college a few hours away and rarely came back to town. When I did, I avoided old classmates. I couldn't stand the thought of running into someone who might still see me as that kid who died in the yearbook. For a long time, I tried not to think about it, but the memory always lingered, like a smudge in the back of my mind. A few months ago, while cleaning out my parents' attic, I found the box with the yearbook. I almost didn't open it, but curiosity got the better of me. My hands shook as I flipped through the pages, searching for the memorial section. The page was there, but something was wrong. My picture had faded, the ink so pale that it was barely visible. My name, my birth date, the death date. All of it was blurry, like the page was erasing itself. I stared at it, heart pounding, until I couldn't take it anymore. I slammed the book shut and shoved it back into the box. I don't know what happened that year, or why it still haunts me. Was it a prank, a coincidence, a warning, or was it something I'll never be able to explain? All I know is that ever since then, I've felt like I'm living on borrowed time, a ghost trying to convince the world, and myself, that I'm still here. I know what we did that night was stupid. To be fair, we were 17, bored, and way too cocky for our own good. Our high school had always been rumored to be haunted after dark. Just one of those dumb local legends that got passed around during lunch. We didn't believe a word of it, but boredom makes you reckless, and a couple of us dared each other to sneak inside after midnight. It was a bad idea, but we didn't know that yet. It was me, Paul, and Bryson. We hopped the side fence near the gym, hands slipping on the cold metal, and forced open one of the old windows by the cafeteria. The latch was loose, like it always was during school, and it gave way after some wiggling. One by one, we crawled inside, the stillness of the empty building swallowing us whole. I didn't expect the school to feel so different at night. It was wrong somehow, like the space itself had stretched. The hallways seemed impossibly long, lockers loomed taller than they should, and the dim glow of our phone flashlights barely lit the floor in front of us. Every sound we made, footsteps, shuffling backpacks, the whisper of Paul's jacket zipper, echoed forever. We didn't really have a plan. Bragging rights were enough. We stuck close together, creeping toward the main corridor, joking under our breath to shake off the unease. That's when we heard it. The bell. It wasn't a faint sound or something we could shrug off. It was the bell, loud and clear, the same one that signaled the end of every class, a sharp, metallic clang that bounced off the walls, echoing down the halls. One ring, a pause, then another, over and over. We stopped dead. Paul looked at me and muttered, "That's impossible. The whole system's supposed to shut off at night." I asked my dad. He works maintenance. There's no power to the bells after midnight. But there it was, ringing steadily, daring us to move. "Let's get out of here," Bryson whispered, his voice cracking. We turned back the way we came, toward the window by the cafeteria. But when we got there, the latch was locked. We didn't lock it. Hell, we couldn't have, even if we'd tried. It was broken. Bryson tugged at it anyway, swearing under his breath. "Try another door," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. We jogged to the nearest set of double doors, the ones by the gym. Paul threw his weight into them, but they didn't budge. Locked. Every door we tried, same story. Locked tight. That's when we heard the footsteps. At first, they were faint, like someone was pacing far down one of the other halls. Then they got louder, deliberate, heavy booted steps that slapped against the tile floor in a steady rhythm, heading straight for us. Paul's voice was barely a whisper. "Is there Is there a security guard? Bryson shook his head, his face pale in the dim light. There's no night guard. They only check the cameras in the morning. Then who the hell? The steps were almost on top of us now. We ducked behind a row of lockers, my pulse pounding in my ears so hard I thought it might give us away. The footsteps slowed as they reached our hallway intersection. Whoever it was stopped, dead silent, just on the other side of the lockers. I clamped a hand over my mouth to keep from breathing too loud. My phone flashlight was still on, and I shoved it deep into my jacket pocket, praying the glow wouldn't show. One creak, then another. The sound wasn't footsteps anymore. It was something lighter, more deliberate, like fingers brushing against the metal locker doors, slow and lazy, as if whoever, or whatever it was, had all the time in the world. Paul flinched, and I grabbed his arm to keep him still. Then the noise stopped. We stayed frozen, barely daring to breathe, for what felt like an eternity. Then the footsteps started again, moving down the next hallway, growing fainter and fainter until they finally disappeared. Bryson didn't wait for a signal. He bolted, sprinting toward the nearest classroom. The window there was slightly cracked, and he threw it open with shaking hands. Paul and I scrambled after him, barely making it out before the footsteps came back. We didn't stop running until we were 2 blocks away, panting under the glow of a flickering streetlight. None of us said a word. We didn't need to. The next morning, I couldn't let it go. The whole thing replayed in my mind like a bad dream, except I knew it wasn't. Before first period, I caught up with Mr. Blakely, the janitor. Hey, did anything weird happen here last night? Alarms going off or lights? He gave me a look. Nope. Alarm system was quiet. No alerts, no triggers. Why? I hesitated. What about the bells? Did you hear anything with the bells? Mr. Blakely frowned. The bells. Son, those things get disconnected at midnight. There's no way you heard them ringing. I wanted to argue, but I didn't. What could I say? We were never supposed to be in there. And as far as the school knew, nothing happened. No alarms, no camera footage, no sign that 3 idiots had wandered through the halls in the dead of night. But we knew. And that's the part that keeps me awake. Someone, or something, was in there with us. Watching, walking, locking those doors. Someone who left no trace. I still hear the bell sometimes, late at night, when the world is quiet. A faint metallic chime, soft and far away, like it's calling me back. I'm watching you. The first time I found a note in my locker, I thought it was a joke. The second time, I wasn't laughing. A few weeks into my junior year, I was running late to homeroom. I swung open my locker door, half expecting my usual mess of crumpled papers and a half-empty water bottle, when something caught my eye. A folded scrap of paper perched on the top shelf. I paused. At first glance, it looked like trash, but the edges were clean, deliberate. Curious, I unfolded it. The handwriting was sharp and blocky, like someone had pressed too hard with their pen. Just 3 words stared back at me. I'm watching you. I laughed, a short nervous sound that echoed in the empty hallway. A prank, obviously. Maybe one of my friends thought it would be funny to creep me out. I stuffed the note in my backpack and forgot about it. But as the day dragged on, something gnawed at me. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. In algebra, I glanced at the doorway more than once, half expecting to see someone lurking there. Between classes, I kept catching myself looking over my shoulder. Nobody seemed out of place, but still, I felt exposed. The next morning, there was another note waiting for me. This one was worse. You looked stressed in algebra. Tell Mr. Davies you need extra time. My stomach flipped. Algebra was my first period, and the quiz had wrecked me. I'd tapped my pen against my desk so many times that the girl next to me asked me to stop. How could anyone know that? I scanned the hallway, searching for some sign of the prankster. A smirk, a glance that lingered too long, but no one looked at me twice. Whoever left that note must have done it before school even started. That day, I barely touched my lunch. I kept my head down, hyper-aware of the other students around me. But the feeling didn't go away. It wasn't just the notes anymore. It was the sense that every step I took, every move I made was being cataloged. The notes didn't stop. 3-4 times a week, I'd find them tucked into the same spot on my top shelf. They were never threatening, just observational. That made them worse. You always tap your pen 3 times before writing. You didn't eat much at lunch again. You like to walk past the auditorium after school, I know why. It was like someone had crawled inside my head, memorizing my routines, my habits, the things I barely noticed about myself. Each note peeled back another layer of me, and I hated how naked it made me feel. After 2 weeks, I cracked. I gathered the notes, carefully folded, as if touching them too long might infect me, and brought them to the guidance counselor, Mr. Kimball. He frowned as he read them, his mouth tightening at the edges. "This is serious," he said. "I'll bring these to the principal. We'll check the security cameras and ask around. Don't worry, we'll figure this out." I wanted to believe him, but something about the way he shuffled the notes into his desk drawer made me feel like I'd just handed over a piece of myself that I couldn't get back. Days later, the principal called me into his office. They'd reviewed the camera footage. Nothing. No one loitering near my locker. No one slipping a note inside. They asked me questions. Did I have enemies? Had I upset anyone recently? Was I sure I wasn't imagining this? Imagining it. Like I wanted this to happen. Like I wanted to wake up every morning with a knot in my stomach, dreading the sound of my locker door creaking open. I told them the truth. I didn't have enemies. I didn't even have drama. I wasn't the kind of person people noticed, let alone targeted. When I left the office, I felt smaller, more alone. The paranoia seeped into everything. I started changing my routines. I walked new hallways, lingered in classrooms after the bell. I even asked to switch lockers, but the school was at capacity. The notes kept coming. By then, I didn't need to open my locker to feel the weight of them. Every time I reached for the handle, my chest tightened, bracing for what I'd find. And then, suddenly it stopped. 2 weeks passed without a single note. No paper waiting for me in the mornings. No observations worming their way under my skin. The silence should have been comforting, but it wasn't. It felt wrong, like the quiet after a storm when you know another is on the horizon. Even now, months later, I still listen for the faint crinkle of paper when I open my locker. I still pause in the hallways, waiting to catch someone's eyes lingering on me just a little too long. The notes are gone, but the feeling isn't. Whoever it was, they knew me in a way no one else ever has. They saw me, not the version of me I show to the world, but the quiet parts, the private moments I thought belonged only to me. They had peeled me apart, piece by piece, and left me hollow. I still have the notes tucked away in a folder at home. I can't bring myself to throw them out, even though I know I should. Sometimes I take them out and read them, searching for something I might have missed, a clue, a pattern, anything to tell me why. But there's nothing. Maybe that's the worst part, not knowing who, not knowing why. Knowing only this: if it could happen once, it could happen again. And sometimes, in the moments between thoughts, I feel it, a flicker, a presence, the weight of someone just outside my vision, watching. This happened during my junior year of high school, on a chilly November evening. One of those nights when the cold settles in your bones and makes the world feel empty. I'd stayed late for our winter play rehearsal, losing track of time as I gathered scattered props and folded costume pieces long after everyone else had gone. By the time I stepped outside, the main doors had clicked shut behind me, and the school grounds were nearly silent. The parking lot spread out before me like a dim, hollow stage, a few security lights blinking overhead, their buzzing hum filling the quiet. I could see my own breath in the air. At the far end, near the chain-link fence by the exit gate, idled a lone sedan, dark, still, and patient. Its engine purred too softly, as if it were waiting for something. I noticed a silhouette in the driver's seat, motionless, watching. At first, I tried not to think much of it. Parents did linger sometimes, waiting to pick up their kids. But the moment I passed under a flickering streetlight, I heard the whir of a lowering window. The man inside leaned forward slightly. The glow from the lamp caught his face in uneven fragments, just enough to make out his eyes and the rigid set of his mouth. "Need a ride?" he asked, calm and too practiced. "I'm here for my kid." I hesitated, alarmed by how easily he slipped that line out, as if he'd rehearsed it. My heart gave a nervous flutter. I knew most of the parents involved in after-school activities. He wasn't one of them. My stomach tightened, and I forced my voice to stay steady. "No thanks," I said, shaking my head. "I'm good. My parents will be here soon." He paused, then tried again, leaning a fraction closer. "You sure?" His tone felt off, too casual, too even. "It's cold out. I don't mind taking you home." I clenched my fists inside my jacket pockets, fingernails pressing into my palms. My throat felt tight, as if a hand were gently closing around it. I swallowed hard and took a step back. The air smelled faintly of wet leaves and asphalt, and every crunch under my shoes sounded too loud, like I was announcing my fear. "No," I repeated, voice quieter. "I'm okay." Without waiting for a response, I started walking toward the main road, forcing my feet to move at a steady pace. At the corner of the lot, I dared a quick glance over my shoulder. The sedan rolled forward, tailing me at a distance that could be mistaken for coincidence, if I didn't know better. I turned onto a side street, dimmer and quieter, hoping he'd peel away. Instead, I caught the glow of his headlights bouncing off a stop sign as he followed. My pulse throbbed in my temples. What if I ran? Would he chase me? I could almost feel his eyes on my back, measuring my steps. I crossed to the other side of the street, my legs jittery with adrenaline. He matched my turn. I tried to think straight. The gas station was about 3 blocks ahead, its neon signs and bright lights a refuge in the darkness. If I could just get there, maybe I'd be safe. Each stride felt heavier than the last. My palms were damp with sweat, despite the cold. Eventually, the gas station's lights came into view, harsh fluorescent beams cutting through the gloom, illuminating rows of candy bars and scratch-off tickets inside. I stepped onto the lot, and the hum of its overhead lamps buzzed in my ears. Once I reached the corner of the building, I turned and saw the sedan hovering at the edge of the block. The man lingered for a second, eyes fixed on me, then suddenly revved the engine and sped down a side street, vanishing as abruptly as he'd appeared. Inside, the cashier looked up, startled by my wide-eyed entrance. The smell of coffee and disinfectant steadied me a bit. I stammered out what had happened and asked to borrow his phone. My voice quivered, no longer able to hide the fear. He handed it over without hesitation, while already dialing the police on the store's line. My mom answered on the third ring. Her voice cracked with worry as I explained that some man had followed me and I needed Dad to come right away. My father arrived within minutes, his face drawn tight with concern, almost as pale as mine probably looked. A police officer followed close behind. Under the station's relentless fluorescence, I gave them every detail I remembered. Dark blue sedan, partial license plate numbers, his face half in shadow, the too calm tone of his voice. The officer nodded, took notes, and told me they'd keep an eye out. That night, sleep came slowly and fitfully. My mind replayed the moment when he first called out, the low hum of his engine, the way he tapped his fingers on the steering wheel as if he had time to spare. I wondered what he wanted, who he was. The next afternoon, the school's resource officer pulled me aside. The police had found the sedan abandoned in an alley not far from that gas station. Doors unlocked, keys gone, driver vanished. I never learned anything more. Sometimes I imagine him drifting from one darkened street to another, always waiting, always searching. Even now, when I pass through that parking lot in the late afternoon, I catch myself glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see his silhouette leaning forward again. I'll never forget how his voice sounded, too measured, too patient, like he'd already decided something, and was just waiting for me to give him the chance. I was a first-year teacher at a small high school just outside the city. It was late October, the kind of damp, overcast morning that leaves you feeling clammy under your sweater. The air had that stale chill, and as the morning bell rang, the district's scheduled fire drill was already on my mind. We'd done it a dozen times. Alarm blares, line up, exit calmly to the main assembly area. Simple, predictable. Even my students, fidgety and distracted by the upcoming homecoming, knew the routine by heart. 10 minutes into homeroom, the alarm shrieked across the halls. My students stood, some rolling their eyes, others grateful for a brief escape from class. Grabbing my attendance folder, I guided them into the corridor. The hallway smelled faintly of damp concrete and old textbooks, and the siren's echo made it hard to think straight. We shuffled toward the designated stairwell, merging with other classes, the clatter of shoes on linoleum almost as loud as the alarm itself. That's when I saw him. A firefighter, at least he appeared to be one, stood at the junction of two corridors, beckoning groups of students toward a side exit. This was strange. The assembly area was always out front, never through that storage wing door. Something about him felt off. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered slightly, or maybe it was just my eyes struggling to focus through the controlled chaos. I slowed my class, taking a closer look. His uniform seemed a shade too dull, the reflective stripes uneven, and his helmet scuffed in odd places. He avoided eye contact, keeping his face partly turned away. I noticed how his gloved hand twitched at his collar, and the gear he wore seemed heavy on him. He stood with a slight slump rather than the alert, purposeful stance I'd seen in real firefighters. more unnerving was his silence. Where was the usual crisp authority, the shouted instructions? He never lifted a radio to check in or coordinate. He just pointed, again and again, almost urgently, to that side door. I took one step toward him, unsure if this was some last-minute change we'd never been told about. But my gut screamed, no. The corridor leading to the side exit was rarely used, mostly storage rooms and a loading dock. Why send kids there? I glanced back at my students, who watched me expectantly. They trusted me to guide them, just as I trusted the protocol. Something didn't add up. Before I could speak, Ms. Lee from the English department came up from behind. She approached the man directly, shoulders squared, her expression firm. I watched her lips move, but the alarm swallowed her words. His reaction, however, was telling. He stiffened, glancing sideways as if gauging escape routes. Ms. Lee's eyes narrowed. She threw up a hand, halting her line of seniors and turning to shout over the din. "Don't follow him. Main exit now." The tension crackled. The man's posture shifted. For a brief second, it looked like he might try to block her or grab her. Instead, he hesitated. Just a fraction of a second, but long enough for me to see the indecision in his stance. Then he bolted. He shoved open the heavy door with a metal clang that reverberated down the hallway, and he ran awkwardly, his boots thudding as he vanished into the outside gloom. The alarm still screamed, and the scent of damp cement hung in the hall, as if holding its breath with us. Outside at the assembly area, real firefighters stood in their crisp, clean gear, radios crackling with calm instructions. I reported what happened, and the principal's face went pale. Within minutes, police swarmed in. Students whispered anxiously, some nervously laughing it off, others looking genuinely unsettled. A few asked if it was a test by the school. We had no answers. By lunchtime, we knew the basics. He was no firefighter. No one recognized him. The security cameras caught him slipping in right after the alarm started, an intruder exploiting a routine safety measure. The police searched and questioned, but he had evaporated into the neighborhood with no trace. No one could fathom his intentions. We were left with the knowledge that he'd tried to lead students into a secluded wing of the building for reasons unknown. The aftermath hung heavy over the halls. Parents demanded tighter security. The district obliged. We added ID checks, more drills, and more staff to watch the exits. In the weeks that followed, I couldn't shake the sickening thought of what almost happened. Every time I heard the alarm for a drill, my pulse quickened. I'd see his faded uniform in my mind's eye, his gloved hand twitching, his face turned away. I wondered about Ms. Lee, too. How she looked so fearless in that moment, calling him out without hesitation. I still think about him sometimes, especially late at night when my mind wanders into dark what-ifs. I picture that quiet corridor and how easily we trust a uniform. I imagine students trapped in some storage room or worse, their cries muffled by cinder-block walls. That never happened, thank God. But the possibility lingers, haunting me with a simple truth. The scariest monsters don't always snarl or crawl from under the bed. Sometimes they stand right in front of us, wearing the symbols of safety, waiting for a chance to shatter our sense of security forever. I remember the fall dance not for the music or the decorations, but for the stranger who slipped into our world so smoothly I almost doubted what I'd seen. Usually, our school dances follow a predictable script. The popular kids cluster at the center. The more timid souls shuffle along the edges, and teachers keep an eye on us from the sidelines. It's a comfortable little ecosystem, until that night when I spotted him near the snack table. At first glance, he blended right in. He wore a neat polo and jeans, sipping punch like he'd chaperoned 100 times before. I remember thinking, he might be a parent, or maybe a friend's older cousin helping out. But something was off. He chatted easily with a couple of kids grabbing cookies, smiling at their jokes like he belonged there. Yet I couldn't place his face. This was my 3rd year at the school. I knew the usual chaperones by now, and this guy wasn't one of them. I tried to brush it off. Maybe I was overthinking. But as the night went on, I caught him studying the gym as if cataloging it. He'd glance at the dance floor, then the exits, then at the groups of students. He moved casually, never staying in one spot too long, and when I met his eyes, he looked right through me as if I were background noise. Eventually, I couldn't ignore the gnawing in my gut. I nudged a friend and pointed him out. She squinted, shrugged, and said, "Must be someone's dad." Relax. She went back to dancing. I tried to relax too, but I ended up trailing him at a distance, pretending to refill my cup when he did. Then Mr. Jones, our security guard, intercepted him. I inched closer, pressing against the wall so they wouldn't notice. The stranger acted cool. He smiled, said something that made Mr. Jones narrow his eyes. When asked to name the student he was here for, he hesitated, tried to pass off a vague name. Mr. Jones waited, arms crossed. Finally, the stranger let out this tiny sigh, like he'd been caught trying to sneak backstage at a concert. He was escorted out quietly, no shouting, no scene. 2 minutes, start to finish. Hardly anyone noticed. The rest of the dance moved forward like nothing happened. We laughed, we shouted over the music, and within an hour everyone had forgotten about the intruder, except me. Something about his calm compliance, how easily he slipped in and out, stuck in my mind. After the dance, I lingered near the snack table. That's when I spotted a small black memory card on the floor, half hidden under a discarded napkin. It must have slipped from his pocket. I picked it up without thinking, my stomach lurching. A few days later, word started spreading. This wasn't the first time he'd shown up. He'd appeared at a football game 2 weeks earlier and a theater performance before that, always drifting in, observing, then vanishing. Rumors flew. Some said he was a reporter working on an exposé. Others whispered he might be scouting the place for something worse. No one confirmed a thing, but I knew what I held in my hand. I borrowed a friend's laptop and popped the memory card in late one night. There were photos, dozens of them, shots of the gym, the locker rooms, kids by the field, students smiling in the cafeteria from behind windows. Some were zoomed in on specific faces, classmates I recognized, a teacher looking away, the band practicing. It wasn't just our dance. It was a silent record of our daily routines. We were unwitting actors in a stranger's private documentary. I closed the laptop, heart hammering. There was no violent climax, no dramatic confrontation, but the fear was real and lasting. The man had infiltrated our safe spaces so gently that none of us sounded the alarm until he slipped up. He didn't need to commit a crime on the spot to terrify me. He'd already done it in a way. He shattered the illusion that our school events were a bubble, sealed off from the outside world. From then on, I caught myself scanning every crowd for faces that didn't belong, checking over my shoulder more often than I'd admit. I never learned who he was or what he planned. Maybe the authorities did, or maybe he disappeared for good. Either way, I know now that real danger doesn't always announce itself with screams. Sometimes it just stands near the punch bowl, smiling at jokes it shouldn't understand, quietly learning your world. And sometimes it leaves behind a memory card filled with the pictures of your life, taken without your permission. It started with whispers about a white van that didn't belong. Some said it had been circling the neighborhood for weeks, idling near bus stops or parked just beyond the school's main gate. At first, I dismissed it. It sounded like the kind of story middle schoolers invented to scare each other, just another urban legend. But that changed the first time I saw it for myself. I was walking home, backpack heavy on my shoulders, when I caught a glimpse of it parked at the edge of the block. Its paint was a sickly, faded white, like milk left out too long, and the back windows were sealed off with blank metal panels. There was no logo, no plates, no sign it belonged to anyone. Just a hum of the engine and a dark windshield, so deeply tinted it could have been a void. My chest tightened as I hurried past, my reflection briefly flashing across the glass. The driver never rolled down the window, never said a word. But I swear I could feel them watching. That was how it began. Silent, unobtrusive, but impossible to ignore. By the time the rest of us started paying attention, the van had become a regular fixture, lurking just far enough away to avoid confrontation. Every day after dismissal, it appeared a block or two from school, sometimes rolling forward at the same slow, deliberate pace we walked. The routine became almost ritualistic. Kids filing out of the building, glancing over their shoulders, scanning the street for pale white paint. The police came once or twice, strolling around with bored expressions, but the van always disappeared before they arrived. When the officers left, it returned. It always returned. At first, we joked about it. It felt safer to laugh, to reduce the van to a silly dare. What if it's a kidnapper? Someone would say. Maybe a serial killer. What if it's aliens? Nervous laughter followed, but no one could quite shake the unease. Soon the jokes faded. By the second week, the whole school was on edge. The van became something out of a collective nightmare. Even the teachers noticed it, their eyes darting nervously toward the street as they waved us off at the gates. Walk in groups, they said. Stay in well-lit areas. The principal assured us they were monitoring the situation, but it was clear they didn't have a clue what to do. Then came Jess's encounter. Jess was my best friend, the kind of person who could crack a joke even in the middle of a math test and make you forget you were failing. She didn't scare easily, which made what happened that day so much worse. It was a Thursday, and the van was closer than usual, parked at the edge of the crosswalk we all used to head home. The afternoon sun caught on its dull surface, and for the first time, the side door wasn't shut all the way. A sliver of shadow moved inside. I was walking behind Jess when it happened. The door slid open a few inches, just enough to reveal the outline of a figure in the driver's seat. And then they said her name. Jess. It wasn't a shout or a threat. It was quiet, conversational, like they knew her. Jess froze mid-step. For a second, I thought she was going to collapse. Her face turned pale, her eyes wide with something I'd never seen in her before. Terror. She stumbled backward, muttering, "No, no, no," under her breath. Then, as if snapping out of a trance, she bolted toward me. The door slammed shut, and the van peeled off with a screech, leaving behind the stench of burned rubber and something colder. like the air itself had been violated. Jess didn't come to school the next day, or the day after that. We reported the incident immediately. The principal nodded gravely and made a big show of calling the police. A patrol car rolled through the next morning, officers standing around sipping coffee, trying to look useful. But the van didn't come back that day, or the next. When it did reappear, it was quieter, subtler, like it knew how to avoid the patrol routes. The adults tried to convince us everything was fine. Just stay alert, they said, as though vigilance was enough to stop someone who already knew our names. We began to understand that they couldn't or wouldn't protect us. Their concern was performative, a facade to mask how helpless they really were, and so we adapted. Kids formed groups not out of friendship, but out of necessity. Rumors spread like wildfire. The driver was a former teacher, a drifter, a ghost. Some swore they'd seen the van outside their homes at night. Others whispered about kids from nearby towns who'd gone missing. Jess's empty locker became a grim reminder of how easily someone could vanish. No one talked about her directly. Talking meant admitting something terrible had happened. The last time I saw Jess was 2 weeks later. She texted me that morning, saying she'd finally returned to school. "Meet me at the gate after dismissal," she wrote. "I'm sick of being scared." I waited for her at the gate, stomach tight with unease. When she finally appeared, she looked hollowed out, like something had been drained from her. Her usual easy smile was gone, replaced by a strained grimace. We walked together in tense silence. Halfway home, the now familiar cough of the van's engine broke the quiet. I turned and saw it creeping behind us, headlights off, its pale body gleaming under the dimming sun. "Let's cut through the alley," I said, grabbing Jess's arm. We ducked into the narrow passage, our steps quickening, the sound of the van's engine growing fainter behind us. For a moment, I thought we'd escaped. But as we stepped onto the side street, there it was, waiting for us. The van blocked the sidewalk, its engine idling softly, predator-like. The side door slid open. Everything happened too fast. A hand shot out, gripping Jess's arm and yanking her inside. Her scream was sharp and ragged, cutting off as the door slammed shut. I lunged forward, my fingers grazing the van's cold metal surface, but it was already gone, tires screeching as it sped around the corner. I stood there frozen, gasping for air. Jess was gone. The police came that night. They took my statement, asked questions I barely remember answering. Their faces were grim but distant, like they were already bracing for the worst. The principal addressed the school the next morning, voice trembling as he urged anyone with information to step forward. But it didn't matter. Jess was just gone. The van stopped showing up after that. Maybe it moved on to another town, another group of kids to hunt. The adults acted like its disappearance was a victory, but we knew better. We still walked in groups, still scanned every parked car and flicker of white paint. The fear never left us. It just settled in, like a shadow in the corner of your vision. I catch myself looking over my shoulder sometimes, half expecting to see it lurking down an empty street. The van, the driver, those tinted windows, they became a part of us, a scar we carried quietly. Even now, I wonder where it went. I wonder whose name the driver speaks now, whose steps they follow home. Because it's still out there, somewhere, waiting. I first felt it before I really understood it. This strange, prickling sensation at the back of my neck. It was late September, and we were halfway through soccer practice, running penalty drills under a sky turning from soft blue to dusky pink. I should have been focusing on my footwork, but something felt off. At one point, before taking a shot, I glanced up into the bleachers. He was there, sitting still. I couldn't see his face clearly beneath the hood, but I knew he was looking right at me. I tried telling myself it was nothing. The bleachers always had a few stragglers, parents waiting for younger siblings, a curious student, someone using the Wi-Fi. But over the next week, every time I looked, he was there, watching. No camera, no phone, just watching. When I ran laps, his head turned to follow my path. When I did cool-down stretches, I could feel his eyes on me, and the hair on my arms would stand on end. I started spotting him elsewhere too. Once, after practice, I left through a side gate to avoid the main crowd. I thought I saw him leaning against the chain-link fence, half hidden by the equipment shed. But when I looked again, he was gone. Another time, I caught a glimpse of a figure in a similar hooded jacket at the convenience store across the street, just standing by the magazine rack, too far inside to be waiting for someone at the entrance. It was never anything I could prove, always just out of reach. I started to doubt myself. Was I imagining it? Then came our first away game of the season, about an hour's drive from home. As I jogged onto the field for warm-ups, I did my usual scan. Parents and classmates were sprinkled through the stands, and there he was again, a few rows behind our bench, leaning forward, elbows on his knees. No team apparel, no smile, no conversation with anyone around him. Just eyes fixed on me. My stomach sank. I couldn't pretend now. Nobody makes that drive just to watch a random practice player. Nobody silently follows a team that isn't even top-ranked, unless they're following a specific person. By the next week, I was scared enough to talk to my coach. I remember sitting in his cramped office, the scent of old sweat and stale coffee lingering, and haltingly explaining my suspicions. To my relief, he took me seriously. After practice the next day, Coach scanned the bleachers, checked the fences, and then asked everyone he knew if they recognized this man. Nothing. Not a parent, not a staff member, not a visiting scout. A stranger, always at the edge of my vision. I tried to keep up a strong front, but inside, I was unraveling. At night, I couldn't sleep. My mind replayed moments on a loop. That hooded figure watching me sprint, those silent stands at away games. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, convinced I heard footsteps outside my window. School became a blur of worry, my grades slipping as I jumped at every unexpected sound. I even stopped hanging out after class, too risky to be the last one leaving the hallway. Coach called the police. They asked me for details I struggled to articulate. Did he ever speak to me? No, he didn't. Touch me? No, he didn't. But there were those glimpses, and one day a note under my windshield wiper. You looked good out there today. The letters were sharp and black, like they'd been pressed hard into the paper. That sealed it for them. Suddenly, patrol cars started circling our parking lot on game days. The officers suggested changing routines. My dad installed a motion-activated floodlight in our backyard. My mom rearranged her work schedule so I'd never be home alone. But the precautions didn't stop him. The police captured a partial image of his face on a school security camera. They discovered he'd been following me for months, since before the season even started. He'd been at scrimmages I barely remembered, hanging back where no one paid attention. The officers told me to be cautious, that these patterns often escalate. My heart thumped every time I turned a corner, and I hardly ever went anywhere without a friend. Then, one bitterly cold Friday night, after a home match, it happened. Most of my teammates had already left, excited to celebrate our win. My parents were waiting in the front lot. I should have followed them out that way. Instead, I was tired, still rattled from a week of poor sleep, and I stepped out through a side door of the gym, hoping to save a minute's walk. The moment the door swung shut behind me, I sensed it. The air was crisp, every sound amplified in the stillness. Footsteps, quiet, measured, came from my left. I turned my head, my breath catching. He was there, leaning against a parked sedan. Under the muted glow of a distant streetlight, I could finally see his face. Mid-40s maybe, stubble along his jaw, eyes that didn't blink enough. He stood straighter, just a few yards away, and said my name. My name. The sound of it in his mouth froze me. My heart hammered so hard I could feel it in my temples. He stepped forward, slow and calm, as if there were no police searches, no floodlights, no frantic parents waiting for me on the other side of the building. The world narrowed to the quiet scuff of his shoes on the asphalt. I could smell the damp leaves and a faint whiff of car exhaust. My pulse thundered, and for a split second, I couldn't move. Fear pinned me in place, made my muscles tremble. I caught a flash of his eyes, focused, intent. He was too close, too real. Then adrenaline kicked in. I screamed, loud, raw, a desperate animal sound echoing off the brick walls. I turned and ran for the door, slamming into its shoulder first. Pain shot down my arm, but I didn't stop. Behind me, I heard his footsteps pick up, but not rushing. Just a steady, relentless pursuit. My chest ached as I threw myself into the dimly lit gym. My sneakers squeaked on the polished floor. I screamed again, this time for help, and an officer stationed near the foyer sprinted around the corner, flashlight beams slicing the dark. "Stop!" the officer yelled, but the stalker didn't. He vanished down another corridor, slipping out some back exit. Backup arrived within minutes. They searched the area, but he was gone again. No shouts, no scuffle, just evaporated into the night. It took them days, but they finally caught him sleeping in his car 2 towns over. Inside, they found photos. Images of me leaving my house, walking into class, practicing at the field months before I'd even noticed him. He had notes detailing my daily schedule, my jersey number, my usual routes home. People ask me if I feel relieved now that he's caught. I guess I do in a way. But I'm not the same person I was. There's a hardness in me now, an edge I didn't have before. Even though the police say he'll be locked up for a long time, I still find my eyes drawn to distant corners, to quiet doorways, to unoccupied seats in the bleachers. I've lost some invisible layer of trust in the world. I've stopped assuming strangers have harmless reasons to be where they are. I hesitate now when someone calls my name unexpectedly, even if it's just a friend catching up behind me. The worst part? I'll never know why he chose me. It wasn't personal, not in the way we understand friendships or rivalries. There was no past connection, no reason. He just decided to watch, to follow, to close in. That random cruelty is what leaves me awake at night, long after the floodlight in my backyard flickers off and the world goes quiet. It's the knowledge that sometimes there's no motive at all. Just a stranger stepping out of the shadows, invading your life, and reminding you that safety can vanish in an instant. It happened about 6 years ago, when I was a junior in high school. I'd never been the kind of kid who got detention, But that day, I mouthed off to a substitute teacher who wouldn't let me turn in a late project. That's how I found myself stuck after school with 5 other unlucky souls, assigned to clean out an old storage room in the basement. Until that day, I didn't even know our school had a basement. It wasn't forbidden exactly, but it was definitely off limits. Nobody ever talked about it. No rumors, no creepy stories. Just a place we weren't supposed to go. A history teacher led us down the stairs that afternoon, his hands gripping the rusted railing as he descended the creaking concrete steps. The air grew heavier with every step, cool and damp, like we'd stepped into a tomb. The buzzing fluorescent lights overhead flickered, casting our shadows long against the walls. When we reached the bottom, the teacher handed us gloves, cardboard boxes, and a simple instruction. Sort through the junk and bring up anything useful. The room was packed with decades of forgotten clutter. Faded textbooks, broken lab equipment, even old trophies no one cared about anymore. We'd only been at it for 20 minutes when Evan, my friend since middle school, noticed the door. "Hey, what's that?" he asked, wiping the dust from his hands on his jeans. At first, I didn't see what he was pointing at. The door was recessed into the far wall of the corridor, partly hidden in shadow. Heavy and industrial, it didn't look like it belonged in a school. There was no sign, no room number, and the entire frame was sealed with bolts, thick, rusted ones that looked older than my parents. Our teacher froze mid-step when he noticed us looking, his face drained of color. "It's off limits," he said sharply, striding toward us. His voice, usually calm and easygoing, was taut with unease. "Don't touch it. Just focus on your work." We nodded, but the atmosphere shifted after that. The teacher, who'd been relaxed when we started, stayed close for the rest of detention, pacing the room as if afraid we might wander too close to the door again. It wasn't until later, when we were hauling boxes upstairs, that I overheard the first whisper of something strange. I'd lingered behind to tie my shoelace, my hands fumbling with the laces in the dim light. Around the corner, 2 staff members were talking quietly, just far enough away that they probably thought no one could hear. "Last teacher who went down there never came back," one of them said. His voice was low, nervous. The other one shushed him immediately. "Don't spread rumors. That was decades ago. Just drop it." Still, the first whispered, "You think they sealed it up for nothing?" They were gone before I could catch more. I stood there, heart pounding, my shoelace forgotten. A teacher had disappeared? What the hell had they meant? The next few days, I couldn't get the conversation out of my head. I started asking around, casually at first. Most people shrugged me off. The librarians had no record of a missing teacher. My other teachers dismissed the idea entirely, some of them with a tight smile that didn't reach their eyes. But an older janitor finally let something slip. "It was before my time," he said, leaning on his mop handle. "But yeah, I heard about it. Some teacher went missing back in the 70s. They said he was last seen heading into the basement." He glanced around as though someone might overhear. "But that's all I know. Don't go digging into it, kid. It's not worth the trouble." That only made me want to know more. The following Thursday during lunch, Evan and I decided to sneak back down. "Are you sure about this?" Evan asked as we slipped past the authorized personnel only sign taped haphazardly to the basement stairwell. "Not even a little," I admitted, gripping the screwdriver I'd stolen from my dad's toolbox. The basement was just as we'd left it, quiet, cold, and buzzing faintly with the hum of fluorescent lights. The door loomed at the end of the corridor, the bolts catching the light like jagged teeth. My stomach twisted, but I forced myself to move. Up close, the door was worse. Scratches crisscrossed the faded paint, deep gouges that splintered the wood beneath. I swallowed hard. The marks weren't random. They were clustered near the center, as if someone had clawed at it, desperate to escape. Evan handed me the screwdriver. His hands were shaking. "Let's get this over with." It took forever to loosen the bolts. The metal groaned and squealed as each one came free, the noise reverberating through the basement. My pulse thundered in my ears, and I kept glancing over my shoulder, sure someone would hear. Finally, the last bolt clattered to the floor. I hesitated. "Ready?" Evan nodded, but he didn't look ready. The door swung open with a low, drawn-out creak. The air hit me first, stale and thick, with an undercurrent of something rancid. My flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating a small windowless room. The walls were bare, cracked concrete. A single wooden chair sat in the middle of the space, warped and splintered with age. At first it seemed empty. Then my light landed on the far corner, and my stomach dropped. A collapsed figure was slumped against the wall, the skeletal remains barely held together by scraps of disintegrating clothing. The jaw hung open in a grotesque grin, the hollow eye sockets staring straight ahead. I gagged, stumbling back. The flashlight wavered, the beam jittering across the remains. Something metallic glinted on the floor, a cracked pair of reading glasses next to a leather handbag. The name etched into the strap stopped me cold. Mike Granger. Evan swore under his breath. "This isn't real. This can't be real." But it was. Whoever this was, they'd been locked in. The claw marks on the door suddenly made horrifying sense. "We need to go," Evan whispered, his voice shaking. I nodded, backing out of the room. My hands fumbled with the bolts, forcing them back into place. My mind raced with questions I couldn't answer. Who was Mike Granger? Why had they been locked away? And why had no one come looking? I graduated and moved on, but the memory stuck with me. I still don't know who Mike Granger was, or why they were locked behind that door. But someone knew. Someone still knows. I'm writing this now because the truth feels too heavy to carry alone. I don't want anything. No answers, no resolution. Just for someone else to know what happened in that basement. It wasn't ghosts or monsters. It was something worse. Something real. And I can't stop wondering how many secrets are still buried down there, sealed away in the dark. I remember the stale smell of disinfectant lingering in the classroom that Wednesday, and the quiet hum of the HVAC system pushing out recycled air. Fourth period Spanish was winding down. I'd been thinking about my little brother, Sam, who was 2 floors down in the library studying for a math test he was dreading. It was just another afternoon until the PA crackled. "Students and staff," Principal Hughes said, his voice thin and strained. "We are now going into lockdown. This is not a drill." My teacher, Mrs. Levin, went rigid. No one asked if he'd said it was not a drill. We all heard it clearly. She flipped off the lights and pulled down the shades with quick, practiced motions. The room fell into half shadow. We moved to the back wall, pressing our shoulders and knees tight against one another. Outside, in the hallway, the fluorescent lights buzzed in that indifferent way they always do. As if this were still just another day. We waited. 10 minutes, maybe 15. Then the PA blared again, a different voice this time, someone frantic and unfamiliar, saying, "Begin evacuation procedures immediately." Mrs. Levin stiffened. Evacuate? That wasn't right. We'd been trained. In a real lockdown, we stay put. Another voice, this time definitely Hugh's, cut through the static. "Do not evacuate. Repeat. Do not evacuate." Conflicting orders back to back left us paralyzed. Mrs. Levin glanced at her phone. No messages, no guidance. Somewhere in the hall, a locker door slammed, or maybe something else metal struck the floor. We all jerked at the sound. In the hush that followed, I could hear my own pulse. Then came the footsteps. Heavy, unhurried steps making their way down the corridor. They drew closer, resonating through the thin walls and scuffed tiles, until they paused right outside our door. Beside me, Trevor's sneakers squeaked softly against the linoleum. Mrs. Levin slowly placed her palm over the doorknob, as if her body alone could keep out whatever was there. I mouthed Sam's name to myself, hoping he was safe, trying not to picture him cowering behind shelves of biographies and encyclopedias. A vibration shattered the silence. Someone's phone receiving a text. It was muffled but loud enough to make the whole class tense. The footsteps at the door shifted, a faint scrape against the floor. My heart hammered so hard I expected everyone to hear it. We held our breath. Long seconds passed. Then the steps continued down the hall, fading into whatever lay beyond. We stayed put as announcements kept contradicting each other, voices overlapping in panic or forced calm. The tension became unbearable. At one point, a girl near the window stifled a sob, pressing her forehead to her knees. Mrs. Levin clenched her jaw, eyes darting between us and the door, determined to keep us silent, safe. We waited for a sign, any clear directive that would break the spell of fear cocooning us. 2 hours in, maybe more, the distant sound of sirens slipped in through the cracks of the school's old windows. Police. Shouts echoed in the hall, authoritative, clipped words that I couldn't quite make out. The door rattled 3 times, a careful knock. Mrs. Levin stood, forehead damp with sweat, and demanded the code phrase we were trained to recognize for a real rescue. When the correct words came, she eased the door open. The hallway was dim, emergency lights blinking. 2 officers waited, sidearms holstered but hands still twitchy. They guided us out, past other classrooms spilling out jittery students and pale-faced teachers. The principal stood near the office, tie undone, talking to an officer who kept shaking his head. I scanned the crowd for Sam, found him standing behind the librarian, eyes huge and tearful. Relief flooded through me, so intense it nearly knocked me over. Later, we heard scraps of what happened. A former student, nobody I'd ever met, had broken in. He toyed with the announcements, sowing confusion. They caught him near the gym. Rumor had it he carried a backpack, but the details were murky. Some said it was full of weapons, others that it was surprisingly empty, just notebooks inside. No one could agree on what he intended, how he got in, or why he triggered the lockdown. The police wouldn't confirm anything beyond, "He's in custody." For all our speculation, we never really learned the whole truth. Classes were canceled for the rest of the week. By Monday, new locks were installed. More cameras were mounted. The smell of fresh paint from the reinforced doors mingled with the ever-present disinfectant. Life resumed in careful increments, but something had changed. Sometimes, during a drill now, I close my eyes and see Mrs. Levin's silhouette against the locked door. the thin light from the hallway outlining her tense shoulders. I hear that unfamiliar voice on the PA, barking orders that make no sense. I imagine the quiet hall with those footsteps approaching, steady, deliberate, and unknown. Then I open my eyes and count the seconds until the all clear comes, hoping the next time will truly be just a drill. It started like any other Thursday, too ordinary to notice the cracks. My last class before the weekend was gym, the one subject I barely tolerated. I hated everything about it. Changing clothes in cramped locker rooms, sharing sweaty air with people I barely knew, the relentless squeak of sneakers on polished wood. But the worst part was the feeling I could never shake, like someone's eyes were always on me. That's why I didn't notice the mistake. When the bell rang, I grabbed the nearest black Nike duffel bag. It looked exactly like mine, and left the locker room, tired, sweaty, and desperate to get home. I didn't even realize it was the wrong bag until I dumped it onto my bedroom floor later that night. The sound it made, a dull, heavy thud, was wrong. I froze. I stared at it for a long moment before unzipping it. No dirty gym clothes, no water bottle, just a thick manila folder sitting right at the top, its weight deliberate. My fingers tingled as I picked it up. Don't look, my brain warned, but curiosity was stronger. I sat cross-legged on my carpet and flipped the folder open. Inside were photos. Tons of photos. At first I tried to make sense of them. They looked like candids, maybe from some event, but something was wrong. The angles were strange, low to the ground, distorted, like the photographer had been hiding. Through windows, behind fences, peeking through cracked doors. And the faces. Kids from my school, kids I knew, smiling, laughing, walking to class, staring at their phones. None of them were looking at the camera. None of them knew they were being watched. My stomach turned cold. And then I saw myself. The photo was recent, just last week. I was sitting in the library reading a book, my head bowed like I'd been perfectly posed. I remembered that day, the quiet peace of being alone. I'd felt invisible, safe. But someone had been there, watching me, framing the shot like I was a target. I dropped the folder. It landed on the floor with a soft rustle, but my hands were still shaking. I wanted to look away, to shove it all back into the bag and forget I'd seen any of it. But more things had fallen out. Handwritten notes, pages scribbled in messy block letters, names, ages, home addresses, locker numbers, and one page, worse than the rest. Targets. The word was scrawled in angry, jagged ink across the top. I felt like I was going to be sick. I didn't sleep that night. I just sat there, staring at the black bag like it might move on its own. By morning, there was only one logical thing to do. Report it. Someone had to know. Someone had to stop this. At school, I didn't even wait for first period. I went straight to the administration office, gripping the bag so tightly my knuckles turned white. I need to talk to Principal Harris. Harris looked surprised to see me. Everything okay? No, I said, my voice cracking. This isn't my bag. I grabbed it by accident yesterday after gym. You need to see what's inside. Harris frowned but took the bag, unzipping it on his desk. The manila folder slid out easily. The room was silent as he flipped through the photos. His expression didn't change at first, neutral, unreadable. Then his jaw tightened. Where did you get this? His voice was too calm, like he was fighting to keep it that way. I told you. I grabbed it by accident. I said, my voice small. "It's not mine. Did you show anyone else?" "No." He stared at me for a moment, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't just looking at me. He was evaluating me. Then carefully, he slid the folder back into the bag and zipped it shut. "We'll handle this," he said, placing the bag behind his desk. "Go to class, and don't talk about this to anyone. Not yet." Something about the way he said it, like a warning, made my skin crawl. I wanted to argue, but my words stuck in my throat. I just nodded and left. At lunch, I noticed someone watching me. I glanced up and my stomach dropped. Mr. Thompson, my gym teacher, sat across the cafeteria at the staff table. His face was calm, expressionless, but his eyes were locked onto me. The bag. It was his bag. The realization hit me so hard it made my head spin. I looked away quickly, trying to act normal, but it didn't matter. He'd seen me react. For the rest of the day, I felt like I was being followed. I saw him everywhere, standing just outside my classroom door, watching from the edge of the gym, lingering at the end of the hallway. I thought I was imagining it, paranoid from what I'd seen, but it got worse. The next morning, I found a note tucked into my locker. "Let's keep this between us." No name, no explanation. I nearly dropped it. By Friday, I was unraveling. I waited until I was late for gym, hoping to avoid him. But when I walked into the locker room, the air was deathly still. The black Nike bag was sitting on the bench, open, its contents deliberately displayed. My photo was at the top of the pile. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The door creaked behind me, and I felt a presence, heavy and cold. "Forget something." His voice was soft, almost gentle. I turned. Mr. Thompson stood in the doorway, arms crossed, his face unreadable. "Be careful what you go looking for," he said. "You never know what you'll find." He didn't wait for me to respond. He turned and walked out, his footsteps echoing like gunshots. I stared down at the bag. When I looked back at the bench, the photos were gone. I told Principal Harris everything, the note, the stalking, the locker room. They investigated, but nothing happened. "Misunderstanding," they said. "No evidence." Mr. Thompson was back at school the next day, watching, always watching. We moved away after I broke down and told my parents everything. I don't go to that school anymore. But I still see their faces in my dreams, the kids from the photos. I wonder if they ever realized they were being watched, or if I was the only one unlucky enough to find out. Last week, a package showed up at our new house. No return address. Just a black Nike bag sitting on the porch. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. At first, I thought I was losing things. A notebook, a water bottle, small stuff, easy to misplace. High school's a blur of deadlines, hallways, and half-baked thoughts. I could explain it away. But when I found my locker hanging open one morning, that changed everything. I always lock it. Always. My dad drilled it into me after I lost my gym shoes in middle school. But that day, the lock sat twisted. My pen, the sleek metal one with my initials engraved on the side, was gone. My mom gave it to me at the start of the year. "You're a senior now. No more losing pens." She meant it as a joke, but that pen felt like mine, a piece of me. And someone had taken it. I tried not to spiral. Maybe the lock jammed. Maybe someone grabbed the wrong pen. Maybe I was being paranoid. But I couldn't ignore the feeling. That gnawing unease in my stomach whenever I turned a corner, or the way I'd catch glimpses of someone, just out of sight. A figure, a row of lockers away, lingering, not quite fitting in. It was him. Alex. The name floated back to me from geometry and biology. Classes where he sat quietly, rarely speaking unless a teacher called on him. I don't remember ever hearing him laugh. I never spoke to him outside of a lab partner arrangement last spring. Forgettable. Until he wasn't. It started small. I'd see him at lunch, lingering at tables he never sat at. After school, when I left late from the library, I'd spot him standing near the buses. Just standing. As if he was waiting. But he never boarded. I told myself it was coincidence. Or worse, I was the weird one for noticing him. But the pattern became too clear. He was always there, on the edge of my day, watching. Finally, I asked my friend Rachel about him. Alex? He's quiet, smart, I think. A little weird, maybe. Keeps to himself. Has he ever seemed off to you? I asked. She gave me a look. Are you seriously gossiping about Alex? He's harmless. I let the conversation drop, but the knot in my stomach didn't. 2 Fridays ago, I stayed late after school to finish a lab report in the library. By the time I packed up, it was almost 5, the sky smudged with gold and charcoal. The parking lot was nearly empty, my car sitting in its usual faraway spot. Most kids fought for closer spaces, but I never bothered. I walked quickly, my shoes crunching on gravel as the sun dropped lower. That's when I saw someone. A figure leaned against the trunk of my car. I stopped dead. My brain raced. Maybe a teacher, security, someone checking abandoned cars? But no, it wasn't just someone. I recognized the silhouette. Alex. He was holding something, twirling it lazily between his fingers like he had all the time in the world. As I stepped closer, dread pooled cold in my stomach. It was my pen. The pen that had disappeared from my locker weeks ago. My initials glinted in the last streaks of sunlight. I froze, every muscle locking into place. He looked up, meeting my eyes like we were 2 old friends. He didn't blink, didn't smile. He just watched me. Then he held out the pen, twirling it once more before speaking. I just wanted to get to know you better. His voice was soft, even pleasant, but everything about it was wrong, like hearing a lullaby through static. My breath caught in my throat. That sentence, that reason, cut through every excuse I'd tried to make. He'd taken my notebook, my water bottle, my pen. He'd followed me, mapped my schedule, studied my life as though it were a series of clues. I could barely force words out. Give me my pen. He tilted his head slightly, considering me, before stepping forward and holding it out. I snatched it back, my hand shaking so badly I almost dropped it. He didn't move. Didn't say a word. Just watched me as I backed toward the driver's side door, fumbling for my keys. Every nerve screamed at me to run, but I couldn't turn my back on him. I didn't breathe until I was inside, doors locked, engine on. My hands were slick with sweat as I gripped the wheel. I glanced up once before I pulled away. Alex still stood there, staring, calm as ever, his shadow stretching long across the pavement. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay in bed replaying his words, his face, the weight of that pen in my hand. By morning, my mind was set. I had to tell someone, my parents, the school. Someone needed to know. I reported everything, every missing item, every time I'd seen him where he shouldn't have been. The school listened. My parents demanded a meeting. Alex was called into the office, and within days he was transferred out of my classes. He'll be monitored closely, they told me. That should have been the end of it. For a while I even believed it. It's been 3 weeks since then. I've changed my routes. I check over my shoulder when I leave a room. I double-check my locker before walking away. I haven't seen him in the halls. Rachel swears he's been keeping to himself, but I can't shake the feeling that he's still there, waiting, watching. Yesterday, I stayed late again for a group project. I made it to my car without incident, but when I opened the door, I froze. Sitting on the driver's seat was a folded piece of paper. Nothing else. No handwriting, just blank white. The ink smudged faintly when I touched it. I looked closer and felt my stomach drop. I knew that ink. It was from my pen. The school says he's being monitored, but I don't think they're looking closely enough. I think about it every time I pick up that pen. I'm not the type to overreact, but I know what I saw, what I heard. I've replayed it so many times in my head, each time wondering if it was just my imagination twisting things into something worse. But it wasn't. It happened 2 weeks ago during fourth period. My English teacher, Mrs. Palmer, was in the middle of droning about literary themes, something about sin and guilt in the Scarlet Letter, when I just couldn't anymore. I didn't feel sick. I just needed out. "Bathroom?" I muttered, half raising my hand. She waved me off without looking up. I grabbed the hall pass and left. As soon as the door shut behind me, the air felt cooler. Empty. Like the building had stopped breathing. The bathroom I always used was at the far end of the east hallway. It's part of the older wing of the school, where the tiles are cracked and the ceiling occasionally leaks. I liked it because it was quiet. Other students avoided it, mostly because of the smell. They said rats had died somewhere in the walls, but I didn't care. I preferred being alone. The door was heavy, and when I shoved it open, the hinges groaned. The light inside flickered once, then steadied, buzzing faintly overhead. It's hard to describe how different it felt this time, like the air inside was heavier, stale. There were 3 stalls. The first 2 doors were open, empty. The third at the far end was closed, locked. I ignored it at first. People sometimes leave stalls locked when they're done. Pull the door too hard and the latch clicks shut. Or maybe someone was in there. No big deal. I ducked into the first stall, shut the door inside as the small space folded around me. It was quiet, peaceful almost. Then I heard it. Breathing. At first I thought it was my own, shallow and slow, echoing faintly off the tile. But then I held my breath. The other breathing didn't stop. It was low and deliberate, like someone was being careful. I froze, listening. Then there was a noise, just the faintest rustle, the sound of fabric shifting. My pulse hammered in my ears. Someone was in the locked stall. I bent down, slowly, to check for feet. Nothing. And then I saw it. A phone. Just the lens at first, peeking out from under the door, small and black, like an unblinking eye pointed right at me. I stared at it. It didn't move. It didn't waver. It was steady, watching. For a moment I couldn't process what I was looking at. My brain stuttered, trying to find some normal explanation. Someone was in there, recording. Why? And then it moved. The lens pulled back into the stall, slowly, as though it knew I was watching. I felt like something reached into my chest and squeezed. My throat was dry. I should have screamed or said something, but all I could do was stand there, every muscle locked. And then I heard it again, breathing, but this time it was louder, closer. I bolted. I shoved the stall door open, my backpack catching on the frame as I stumbled out.
I glanced once, just once, at the far stall as I passed. The door was still locked, but the bottom edge of it had changed.
There were fingers there now, long and pale, pressing against the tile floor like they were reaching. I slammed through the bathroom door and ran. My shoes squealed against the tiles, and I didn't stop until I reached Mrs. Palmer's classroom. When I burst inside, everyone stared. My face was hot, and I could feel sweat sliding down my spine, but I didn't care. "There's someone in the bathroom," I gasped, gripping the hall pass so hard it bent. "The east bathroom, the last stall, they're—" I couldn't even say it. "They're watching people." Mrs. Palmer frowned like I was a bad smell. "What on earth are you talking about?" "It's locked, but there's someone inside. Someone breathing." I heard my voice rising, panicked. "I saw a phone. I saw their hands. They were—" "That's enough," she cut me off. "The custodians check the east bathroom every morning. No one's in there." "No, I swear." "Sit down or I'll send you to the office." I sat. My hands wouldn't stop shaking, and no one looked away from me for the rest of class. After school, I went to the office. I had to. I described everything to the assistant principal, Mr. Winfield, and he listened, fingers laced under his chin. When I finished, he sat back in his chair, his face expressionless. "You're not the first student to come in here with a story like this," he said finally. "You're not the first student to come in here with a story like this," he said finally. "What?" I whispered. He shrugged. "We've had kids say things about the east bathroom for years. Locked stalls, sounds, phones under doors. But we've never found anything. But I saw it. I saw someone in there." "I'm sure you thought you did," he said carefully. "The mind can play tricks, especially in old buildings." They closed the east bathroom 2 days later. An out-of-order sign appeared on the door, but I know they didn't send anyone to fix it. I asked one of the janitors about it after school. "It's just old pipes," he said, not meeting my eye. I never went back. But some days, I pass the hallway and see the door propped slightly open. Just an inch, like someone's peeking out. A few kids have asked me what happened. They've started telling stories, rumors about the bathroom. Some say it used to be a hiding place for kids who got in trouble. One kid whispered that it belonged to someone who never left. They don't believe me, though. They laugh. But sometimes, when I'm in a different bathroom, I hear something. The faintest breathing sound coming from the stall next to me. And I know. Whatever it is, it's not just in the east bathroom anymore.